Hello and welcome to episode 214 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Shane, here in Denver, Colorado, and with me on the line from Chicago, Illinois, it's the one and only Godfather, Dave Harbarger.
I'm here now, and I'm also here in the future, and you're here in the future, but you won't be there in the future that I'm in. Is that right, Shane? Do I have that right?
Yeah, it's our recent past and also future. I'm feeling like Marty McFly.
My hand had disappeared.
Marty!
Shane!
It's about your kids!
We did the podcast in non-linear segments this week. Shane! Your segments!
We got you something about your segments. So we're doing the thing we hinted at when Stanislav went on his overseas journey and some segmented content. So this week we're trying something new. It's Dave and Stanislav doing some content. It's me and now regular guest host Devon O'Donnell, aka d00mwake, doing some content. We'll piece it together in the order that we think makes the most sense, I suppose. But this week it's what? What do you think?
Well, we're gonna do it this. So we're gonna do a little talk from you and me. It's gonna be a little talk from you and me, Shane, right here to set everything up, and then it's gonna be me and Stan talking about our recent experimentations. Two surprising things. One, Stan now likes Pioneer.
Oh, he likes Pioneer?
Stay tuned to hear him talking about that.
Spoilers.
Hear the decks that made him finally decide that he kind of likes Pioneer. And then B, I get a little wild in Modern. I play two pretty weird decks. I play Mardu Calibrated Blast, aspiring spike list that he 5-0'd with recently that I thought was interesting. And then I play mono white humans in Modern.
Oh, nice.
As designed and piloted by Hank the Obese, Magic Online player who has been doing well in challenges with it lately. Let's see what happens.
This is exciting. And then, even though we are ostensibly a mostly modern podcast, d00mwake and I talk about Golgari Sacrifice, a newer up-and-coming deck in Pioneer that takes advantage of some awesome new cards from Phyrexia All Will Be One. So you learn about that deck, learn about what Stan's been doing, learn about what you've been doing. I'm hyped. This is fun. Like, now I get to be excited about hearing your stuff for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I was off last week, and I was off of half of this week. It's a dream situation for me.
Yeah, and my stuff is weird, buddy. Wait until you see these deck lists.
Oh my gosh. I'm very amped. Oh yeah, so I was off last week because I was on a business trip, a conference in Salt Lake City.
Mm-hmm.
And then I stuck around in Salt Lake City for a couple days with my wife. We hung out there, got to see a friend of the show, Lou, there for a couple times. That was really nice. Got to see the lovely people of Salt Lake. It's a pretty good way to spend some days. I'll tell you what. I like Salt Lake.
Well, there you go.
You ever been there, Dave?
Yeah, I've done a photo shoot in Salt Lake City before.
Well, when's the last time you were there?
2004. Probably.
Oh my gosh, that's so long
maybe.
ago.
Yeah.
Well, that has very little to do with my recent situation there. So, but
anyway, before we get deep into more great content like this, it's time to do some housekeeping.
Oh, the housekeeping, yes. All right. Dave, we have 4 new patrons.
I know. Thank you so much.
4 new citizens of the Dive Down Nation. We've got Anthony G. We've got Paul. We've got Christopher C. And we've got Mitch Flow 52. Maybe they were born in 1952. We'll find out.
We can only hope.
We've got no increased tiers, but thank you, all 4 of you, for signing your papers, becoming citizens of the Dive Down Nation. We appreciate that direct support. Helps keep us going. Keeps the podcast funded. All the little things we got to pay for add up surprisingly quickly. We do have a new review this week, and that is from our friend of the pod, Oralox. I think we actually talked about Oralox last week because we have one of our paper modern camera events going on that Oralox is always helping us coordinate, or actually coordinating completely independently of us. We appreciate that ongoing work, keeping the community going. But Oralox left a really lovely review the other week saying, take the deepest dive into Magic through the lens of a casual spike. The first part, maybe not so much. The second part, I definitely agree with. It is the lens of the casual spike. We appreciate these kind words words and your ongoing engagement and support of the Dive Down Nation Orlocks.
And if you'd like to support the Dive Down via Patreon, you can check us out at patreon.com/thedivedown. Check out the tiers, get some swag, all of that kind of stuff. Of course, once you come in for $1 a week, you get access to our discreet, definitive Discord server. You can also support us via buying merch at thedivedown.com/store. Go check out shirts, fanny packs, and hats as you wish. And if you'd like to support us in other ways, you can check out some of our partners, Mana Traders, the card rental service we've been using for years and years. I couldn't have played the weird decks that I played this week without Mana Traders, Shane. ManaTraders.com. Use code TheDiveDown10 to get 10% off your first 2 months of a Mana Traders subscription. You can also check out, get paper cards, get a discount at paper cards from our friends at Energy Gaming. Use code DIVE8 from Energy. And then finally, there's Barrister Mann, longtime supporters, partners, friends, smell muses of us at the Dive Down Nation, Will and the team at Barrister Mann. If you want to get some fragrance support, some shaving gear at barristerman.com, the code is TheDiveDown2023. Now, last week, you'll get 15% off your first order, by the way. Now, last week, Stan said it was so great that all of our codes lined up exactly with the percentage discounts that we got. I knew that that would not last forever. Turns out forever came much sooner than we thought.
The Dive Down 2023.
That's right. Okay, so with that out of the way, we are going to cut over to me talking with Stan about what we've been up to lately in Pioneer and Modern. Stay with us.
Look at us, David. We're finally experimenting with the format of the podcast, recording segments across time zones and continents, like we said we would.
This is just me, a conversation among friends about what we did this week in Magic.
Yes. And before we kick off the Magic conversation, I actually have a question to ask you, Dave, since I am drinking my big mug of tea to keep me energized through the show. How do you take your tea? And what kind of tea do you like?
Iced tea only, please. Black tea.
Gotcha.
Yeah. My wife is very much an Earl Grey person. But yes, other than that, I drink decaf coffee only, decaf espresso only.
Oh, God.
I know, it's the weirdest.
I love espresso, but a decaf espresso is strange to me.
I drink iced decaf Americanos every day.
Well, good for you, man.
It's like muddy water with ice chunks in it.
I like Earl Grey, too. Earl Grey is my daytime tea when I'm just like... pounding them, basically. But English breakfast has been my morning and nighttime tea when I need a little extra kick at night to get through the day.
You've been in Manchester for about 3 months now, and you have breakfast tea at night. Things are upside down. What is this?
That's right. Things really are upside down today, Dave. I have to tell you, I feel like I have a confession to make. I'm a little embarrassed right now.
Okay. I'm here for you across the country.
Yeah. Remember how you always said that I could tell you anything and you would always love me no matter what?
Yeah, of course.
Dave, I've been on a bit of a Pioneer kick lately.
I can't believe it, but I can believe it. And I'm ready to accept you into this format with open arms.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about it. I feel like I'm finally kind of understanding what everyone else has been talking about lately. So I'm just going to get into it, if I may.
Okay. Yeah.
Basically, 2 critical things happened that got me here where I am today. And probably they're not particularly surprising, but the first one is...
Birth? Is the first one birth?
Yes. The birth of my son 19 months ago.
Oh okay.
Is that...
I meant your own birth, but...
Yeah, well, I don't remember that one as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Frankly, since I wasn't there, I guess I was there, but since I have no memory of it, can we be certain that it really ever happened?
Man, why don't we remember our own births, man?
Whoa, bro. No, the 2 critical things that happened that got me here today are, 1, I finally found some decks that I really like to play, which I think is this very important hump to get over in anyone's progression and appreciation of any format.
Absolutely. So you said more than decks. You said decks, more than one maybe?
Deck, parentheses, S.
Wow. Okay.
Right. The second thing that happened was in playing the format, especially through the lens of a couple different decks, something finally clicked for me that I actually never really understood before. that now I think has given me a grasp of this format that was important for me to understand what it really takes to participate in Pioneer in a meaningful and perhaps even profitable way.
Profitable, even. Profitable.
Emotionally profitable.
I see.
All right, so let's start with the decks, shall we?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited because, I do like Pioneer.
Yeah.
You've been very Pioneer resistant.
That's right.
I'm curious to see where this is going to go. Let's unveil them.
I don't think either of these decks will take you by surprise. I wonder if you can guess them.
Well, we talked about Elves with Tyvar.
Okay. That's one.
Are we still on Elves with Tyvar?
Well, not with Tyvar, but yeah, we are on Elves, yeah.
Okay, Elves. Is the other one potentially Creativity?
No comment. We'll get to it in a few minutes.
Okay.
All right, so it's true. I've been really, really liking Elves, and not just because I've been a fan of Elves for years and talk about it on this podcast anytime I get the chance to, but I actually think that the Pioneer Elves deck is legit. And the version that I'm playing is one that has been doing fairly well online in the hands of a streamer and MTGO grinder by the name of Xbox Greg. Shout outs to Xbox Greg. Won a Pioneer Challenge with Elves in February, and that's the list that I had played in paper a couple weeks ago and have been playing online as well.
Okay.
This deck is real because it does all the things that good Elves decks do in formats where Elves is good. Period. Okay? It is a go wide aggro deck that uses lords and tokens and 1/1s and other cheap little creatures to get big and establish a significant board state. But perhaps most importantly is that it's capable of generating card advantage. And the really fun part is that it has the ability to just combo kill opponents at instant speed, sometimes as early as like turns 3 or 4, completely out of nowhere, even on opponent's turn.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And we're not doing it with Progenitus.
Are we doing it with, we're doing it with Shaman then, huh?
Shaman of the Pack.
Or no? Yeah, Shaman.
What's unique about this deck compared to previous Elves decks that I've played in meaningful constructed formats, so I'm not talking about historic, is that the combination of Elvish War Master, the David Harbarger lookalike card, your doppelganger.
It's true. I do look like that.
Is probably just the best card in this deck, I think, because it single-handedly produces the massive board states that makes Elves a go-wide deck, but it also enables just about all of your other winning strategies. Coupled with the new-ish Lord from Dominaria United, Leafcrown Visionary, which both makes your 1/1s bigger. It's the only Lord in this deck, in fact, but it's also drawing you a ton of extra gas. And since Leafcrown Visionary is a green card, it's really good with Nykthos as well, which this deck is running. And when you have both of those cards online, the thing that I love about this deck is it just does Glimpse of Nature impressions in Pioneer, because you're making boatloads of mana and then just playing 1-drops or 2-drops or like whatever that keep drawing you extra cards. And when you have a couple Leafcrown Visionaries, you're making that much more mana with Nykthos and drawing that many more cards. Sometimes I feel like it only takes 2-3 turns of having those two pieces in play at the same time, Visionary and Nykthos, to basically set up a kill if your game is actually going a little bit longer and it's, grinding into turns 5 or 6.
Wait. Visionary and... Interesting. Okay, Leafcrown Visionary. For some reason, I imagined Elvish Visionary again for a second. Okay, so I'm looking at the card for the first time more closely, just so people, in case they've forgotten. Leafcrown Visionary, green for a 1/1 that says other elves you control get +1/+1. And then the second line of text says, whenever you cast an elf spell, you may pay green. If you do, draw a card. And there's the kicker. That's what you're talking about there.
That's the kicker.
You are just pumping green into that as you cast to just get more gas.
Yes. And it's not actual Glimpse of Nature, but Nykthos basically makes it effectively that. Because Nykthos is doing a Gaia's Cradle impression.
Exactly.
And then War Master, once again, also sets up your very powerful Shaman of the Pack plays, because War Master, left unchecked, is just producing 1 or 2 extra bodies per turn. If you have multiple War Masters out and you're able to get bodies on your opponent's turn with either Court of Calling or Collected Company, you're then just flooding the board really quickly. And then if you don't have any other way to kill, War Master has this baked-in overrun that you can just sink 7 mana into, give all of your creatures +2/+2 and Death Touch. And I've never activated that and not won the same turn if I'm playing the game where you have to activate it.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like your Azuri, right, from Modern and Legacy Elves. So this is the card that lets you go wide, but also has a mana ability that takes, not a mana ability, an activated ability that takes advantage of that go wide board state.
Yeah, totally. I think Azuri also gives them trample, plus it has a regeneration ability. But this being 2 mana that also generates board states kind of feels better than Azuri because you can play them in multiples. They're better in multiples on the board, especially.
Wow, so you're really just playing a ton of ramp here. In case people haven't seen it, it's 8 of the Elves, 8 Mystic, or 4 Mystics, 4 Llanowar, then Jasper Sentinel as well, which is the one that's kind of like a
Birch Lore
drum, Springleaf Drum.
Springleaf Drum, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like Springleaf Drum. But so it says tap and untap to control, add 1 mana of any color. It's a 1/2 with reach. Then you've got your regular Visionary, and you've got your Leaf Crown Visionary, War Master, Llanowar Visionary, which is the one that costs a little extra, draws a card and taps for mana, and then 4 Shaman in the pack.
Yeah.
4 Quarter Calling, 4 Collected Company, and that is the deck.
That's the deck.
It's a beautiful list.
Yeah, it's so simple.
Xbox, Greg, beautiful, simple.
Crushed it.
How have you been doing with it? So you've been playing it. You took it out a couple of times. Have you played it on Moto?
Have I played it on Moto? Yes, I have played it on Moto, and it was okay. But when I played on Moto, I was still learning, and it was before I took it out in paper. And when I played on Moto, I also faced Rakdos at least once, and that is the nightmare matchup. So just to get that out of the way, like Rakdos, I think, is just about unbeatable unless they have a really bad start, don't find any removal, and you're able to like War Master into Dwinen's Elites and just like create enough bodies that they can't 1-for-1 you. But everything else in the format, including Azorius Control, I think is either within reach, if not favored for Elves. Azorius Control was the biggest surprise for me to essentially figure out how to play against it. And Supreme Verdict is the scary card there, of course. But I find that if you peg your opponent on Azorius early enough and you're developing with the understanding or expectation that they're going to try to Supreme Verdict you on 4, you can probably make enough tokens with War Master and even throw away a Shaman just to do enough pre-Supreme Verdict damage that if they don't draw a second Supreme Verdict, you just rebuild really quickly by not overcommitting and then closing out the game a turn or 2 later. So the first Supreme Verdict, it sucks, but it's not game breaking. It's really the second one that I think is probably unbeatable.
Every tribal player has that on their tombstone.
Yeah.
It's not the first, it's the second verdict.
That's right. But yeah, the rest of the format I felt was really not bad, especially, and perhaps most importantly, the mono green matchup is really chill. I find that mono green's just kind of soft to cheap chub blockers. Like 1/1s aren't necessarily like easy to get through because their only trampler is old growth troll. So if they don't have an old growth troll, or even if they have one, like that's a 5-turn clock that maybe they're getting it out on turn 2 or later. Everything else that they're doing, like you can probably slow them down long enough that you either combo kill them or overrun them. It's also important that mono green doesn't play cheap removal. So you can actually develop however you need to by basically committing to the fastest start that you can without having to play around potential interaction so that, you know, if their defenses are down for a turn, you can sometimes punish them right away with just like Shaman, Cord for Shaman, or Leaf Crown, and just like swing with a bunch of 3/3s or 4/4s. The moment that made me realize how fast Elves can be was actually a match I had against Greasefang, where I was on the draw, and my opponent got Perhelion out on turn 3, and then I still won the match on the crackback. Which, granted, I just had like the absolute sickest draw possible, and my opponent played enough shocklands that they took themselves down. But like, if you can find those lines, Elves is just doing the thing that previous good Elves decks, including Modern and pre-MH1 Modern and to some extent Legacy decks do, which is like, you have these tools, and you're just like solving a puzzle and just trying to figure out like, when do I get in there with either beaters or ideally like a massive 3 mana burn spell and just like closing out the game when our opponents are not prepared for it.
That's awesome.
So yeah, that's Elves. If you like playing these kinds of decks and maybe you're upset that Elves doesn't really have legs in Modern these days and you cannot afford Gaia's Cradle to play it in Legacy, I think this version at least is probably better than people may realize. And I'm not going to make claims about its tiered status, but I think you'll find that it actually can really compete in a format like today's Pioneer.
Awesome. Well, I know that being able to play Elves is a really happy thing for you, so I'm glad that you found a home for a lot of these cards that you like in a format that you're maybe starting to like.
Yeah. I've had Shaman of the Pack since Magic Origins, so like that's what it kind of comes down to. I love playing gold 3-drops.
Who doesn't? However, you said you had another deck to talk about, and
yes.
I think I nailed it. Did I nail it as far as my guess of what the other deck you like in Pioneer is?
No,
I did not.
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay.
Though when you hear it, it probably won't catch you by surprise, to be honest. And it does play another beloved gold 3-drop of ours.
Okay. Well, now I have a lot of anticipation.
It's Azoria Spirits, Dave.
What?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Tribal thoughts on Pioneer from Stan right now. Okay. You got to ship me a list for this to look at.
I picked up Blue-White Spirits for actually 2.5 reasons. One is I thought I would like it just based on playstyle. I had dabbled with spirits before in the past. I want to say like pre-pandemic or early pandemic when we were doing like those very first dive down tournaments when it was still a Slack channel. And I just hadn't picked it up since then. And I'd seen the blue-white version do all right lately. Reed talked about both mono blue and blue-white on his recent post-Pro Tour Pioneer tier list. And I was like, let's take a look at that. But also I've been seeing some versions of this deck start to pick up a couple Skrelv. The new Skrelv.
Whoa.
As a, bad giver of runes, essentially, or just like a type of giver of runes. It's neither good nor bad. And I wanted to try out this new card just for science and see what this type of effect would have on a Pioneer deck. And I got to say, the deck did not disappoint, Dave. And I've got some really fun screenshots to prove it.
Wow, that's awesome. I will say, for people who haven't seen the blue-white one, so this is really close to mono blue spirits that was in Pioneer kind of all on and off the last year. The main difference is we're not playing the other 1 mana spell that came out that lets you draw a card, the other Curiosity, but we are still playing Curious Obsession. So that's really the key to this deck in my mind that makes it like the mono blue Flyers deck. It's got the cheap counters, it's got Curious Obsession, but it is splashing white essentially for a single main deck card and a bunch of sideboard cards. And by a bunch, I mean a lot of sideboard cards. So it's got 4 Spell Queller main.
Yeah.
And then, which, Stan, we know you cannot resist that. Obviously, since new Phyrexia has come out, or whatever this set is called, Phyrexia All Will Be One. It's got 4 Seachrome Coasts to finish that splash, along with Artikar Wastes, and then even Hallowed Fountain and Hengegate Pathway. So you are never hurting for white mana in this deck. It's got a lot of support for it, even though there's not that many white cards in the deck. But other than that, it's your Pioneer blue spirits suite, essentially.
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, it takes no amount of convincing to get me to play a Spell Queller deck. Just next to Shaman of the Pack, probably my next favorite 3-mana gold card. I love playing it in Modern. Haven't had the chance to do that in a long time. Seeing that this deck had picked it up and was doing fairly well with it. It's done really well across challenges. I don't think it's won any recently, but it did. It won the February 18th Pioneer Challenge in the hands of Traft. It's come in second place a lot. I want to see how it felt in my hands. And yeah, like I said, it felt really good. I think one of the obvious things to everyone else that took me a while to realize about this deck, and maybe why I've actually learned to appreciate it so much, is that the play style has more in common with the playstyle of Modern Murktide than other tribal decks or other creature control decks even.
Oh, there's a take. All right, so let me know why you think that. Let's hear it.
Because a lot of games in this one are defined by a turn 1 play that you protect with super cheap counters that then snowballs into potentially a massive source of card advantage. So instead of something like Ragavan or Dragon's Rage Channeler, you're playing Spectral Sailor or Mausoleum Wanderer or Lantern Bearer. And then instead of Expressive Iteration, you're playing Curious Obsession. And a protected Curious Obsession, it turns your Geistlight Snare into a 1-mana mana leak, which is
incredible.
Cocoa bananas. But it's sometimes drawing you like 3 or 4 cards in a single game if you can like curve out with the 1 to 2 mana counters and rattle chains, or if you have extra Mausoleum Wanderers to like do a Spell Pierce or a Force Spike even. Really easy to just like play a good 1-drop that then just does half the damage you need to do to kind of put a bunch of pressure on your opponent early. And then after you've traded resources for a little bit, determined that they can't interact with you or they've run out of interaction, then you play something like Supreme Phantom or Shacklegeist and create a slightly wider board that just runs them over in a turn or two because it's all in the air.
Yeah, and the big key on that pivot, a lot of times I found when I've played Mono Blue Spirits anyway, is getting rattle chains, getting value out of rattle chains, and then also, off of its hexproof trigger, and then also getting value out of bringing things in with flash that you usually wouldn't be able to bring in with flash, like a Supreme Phantom, like your Mausoleum Wanderer, Shacklegeist, stuff like that. Or suddenly you dump a bunch of creatures that you can tap down things people couldn't, didn't see coming with Shacklegeist, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was really impressed with Shacklegeist. Like the instant speed Shacklegeist in particular, just such a blowout for a ton of decks.
Yeah. I mean, I love this shell, and so I'm glad to hear that you're excited to play it too. I have never tried it, at least haven't tried it in Pioneer with Spell Queller at all lately, so maybe it's something worth taking a look at.
Yeah, and again, not to beat the same old drum, but like it has a great mono green devotion matchup.
Yes.
You kind of just don't lose against that deck, even though you're playing mana leaks. They're tapping out so frequently, and you can pick and choose what you actually have to interact with, that you can more or less decide that they're never resolving Karn or Kiora. Like they can have an Old Growth Troll, fine, but as long as they don't get the Cavalier of Thorns, because that one actually has reach, they just can't do anything about your plan.
Yeah, and even when they do, sometimes you just have a wide enough board that you can fly around Cavalier. I mean, fortunately, Cavalier doesn't have like lifelink as well or something, which would really be a problem for this deck.
Yeah, so that's Spirits. Great deck, highly recommended. Regarding Skrelv, notably, not a Spirit. And pretty much all the lists I saw that had it were running 2 in place of another 1-drop called Lantern Bearer.
Yeah, I haven't seen Lantern Bearer in these decks before, by the way. It's interesting to see it in this one.
Yeah,
for sure.
It's not bad, and ultimately I think it's better in this deck than Skrelv is for a couple of reasons. And this is, I played a little over a league. I sent you a screenshot of that league where I had 2 sandwich wins and then 3 losses in the middle, where I beat like a couple decks. I don't even remember what they were, but then I played 3 Greasefang matches in a row, and they just they outplayed me every time.
Housed you.
Yeah, it was not fun. And Skrelv, not particularly good there either. But I think the issue with Skrelv is that it's neither a spirit nor a flyer. So relevant for your interaction and your lords. And the Giver of Runes effect never felt substantively better than just like having counters or rattle chain.
Right.
And likewise, because it's a 2 of that's only good on turn 1, your odds of happening it in your opener are pretty low, but you don't want to play the 4 of because it just doesn't provide a lot of synergy for the rest of your deck. And then drawing it later in the game feels really bad. So if you're playing it as an early Lightning Rod, I just think that, if you're replacing Lantern Bearer with it, I'd rather play the Lightning Rod that you can then disturb out for 3 mana for a little extra reach to close out a game.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. The spirit synergy is tough to miss out on, and you already have plenty of interaction and ways to protect your creatures. So like keeping Curious Obsession online probably isn't important enough to get Skrelv into your deck. You'd rather just have counter spells because those are better in other matchups and stuff like that too. This deck does have kind of a rough matchup against, or at least the blue one had a rough matchup against Rakdos as well. So it's interesting that you have kind of 2 different decks that you're liking that are rugged against Rakdos, but you You're not going to play it every time.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I mean, I think the Rakdos matchup here is winnable, though they probably are the favorite. But if you're on the play and they don't have like a turn one fatal push, you can just sort of snowball. If they're like relying on Dreadbore as their removal spell or Go for the Throat, I think is coming up now a little bit more often. The counters magic as well as the rattle chains are both good enough at blanking those that you can like sometimes eke out a win, though it is hard. Don't get me wrong.
Yep. All right. Well, 2 good tribal decks from Stan this week. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I gotta say, what was the big revelation that I had about Pioneer? Let's put a bow on this whole Pioneer section of mine. The thing that clicked for me was ruminating on a notion I've heard come up a lot, including on episodes of The Dive Down when Sky is on to talk about Pioneer, which is this notion that it's a board-based format where combat matters. I think people generally feel that that's the case with Pioneer. And I think that's kind of like an easy sentence to misinterpret because this isn't a curve-out format where you go like turn 1 Llanowar Elves, turn 2 Rabble Master, right? Like you can't just play a beatdown strategy. And I think the piece that truly clicked for me was that your deck and your creatures have to do a lot of other stuff beyond the board. So they either have to have some kind of like combo plan in the case of Mono Green or Greasefang or Elves or creativity for that matter, or they have to have like really strong disruptive synergies. Things like humans, things like spirits are playing to the board, but they're also just like slowing down the opponent's plan with some kind of removal or other interaction. Or like ideally some amount of all of the above. And I'm not going to get into Lotus Field as like the exception to the rule, but I think once I realized that your cards or your creatures are more than just beaters, they are also like fighting on another axis. And that's basically what it takes to engage in this format. And you more or less just need to find the deck that makes you want to engage under those terms with creatures that are doing things that you find interesting. Like now I just find the Pioneer experience really rewarding. And not just because like I'm winning a bit, but also I'm learning a lot from losing. Like Pioneer Elves, Pioneer Spirits are decks that reward good decision making, good sequencing, understanding when to interact, when to combo off, when to commit to the board, what to hold up counter magic for, what to hold up or find with Court of Calling. And sometimes when I look back at my losses, like I can sort of see the decisions that I've made incorrectly, and being able to reflect on it and know how I need to pack the biggest punch was something that made me feel just like less hopeless in Pioneer matches that I lost previously, where I would just like try something out and then Mono Green would run me over, and it was just like my cards didn't do squat, and it's just like, what is the point of all this? But having a little extra agency helps alleviate that hopeless feeling. And yeah, I think I see myself playing a bit more Pioneer too, and it's nice to like have those decks that I like playing, and the duality between Elves and Pioneer is especially fun just because they like itch different sides of my brain.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, for my part, and again, we hid the decks that we were playing for each other. So Stan, here's what I'd like to ask you.
Yeah.
Are you ready to get weird?
All right, let's try to guess. You played Modern.
I played all Modern this week.
All right,
yes,
cool.
I played all Modern.
Okay, and you also played more than one deck?
I played more than one deck.
Yeah.
Yes, I did.
Do they share creatures, these decks?
They do not share creatures or colors.
Oh,
in fact.
Okay. So then I guess neither of them are an Omnath deck, because Omnath decks are all colors.
Correct. That's a good process of elimination there. I did not play any Omnath.
Yeah, so I'm guessing you played Scam and Hammer.
Wow. You know what? You got the colors right.
Okay.
They're not the right decks. All right, here we go. Here's deck number 1. I'm going to show you a screen grab of it. I'm sharing a screen with Stan right now. So the first deck that I took a look at, I looked at 2 deck lists that caught my eye. Listen to Stan laughing. He's a happy guy. Listen to him looking at this deck list right now. I played 2 different decks this week. Both of them caught my eye on Twitter or various places. First one we're going to talk about really quick was a list from Aspiring Spike.
I've never seen this. I have no idea what this is. Some of the cards
You're
are
looking at the deck
recognizable.
list right now.
Yeah, I'm looking at this deck, and this is... If you told me you had brewed this up this morning, I would have believed you.
Well, I didn't brew this up, but our good friend Everett did brew this up and got a 5-0 with this about a week and a half ago, if you can believe it. So everybody, here's what it is. It is Mardu Calibrated Blast is the first deck that I decided to play this week. Here's what's in it. If I told you that there was a deck that had Fury, Leyline Binding, Lightning Bolt, Thoughtseize, Scion of Draco, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, Seasoned Pyromancer, Shadow Prophecy, Shadow of Mortality, and Calibrated Blast in it, what would you say?
I would say, what is Shadow of Mortality? And
you would say, nice trade binder, friend.
And I would also add, why are you playing Scion of Draco in a deck that's not Domain Zoo?
So here's the thing. This is a weird take on Calibrated Blast. So everybody knows Calibrated Blast, right? Calibrated Blast is a deck that generally doesn't have all that many cards in it that aren't Calibrated Blast targets. And this deck is full of... So the normal Calibrated Blast targets are like Scion of Draco's in that deck, Shadow of Mortality is in that deck. Shadow of Mortality is that giant 15 mana cost card from Streets of New Capenna that if you are lower than, it has a reduced casting cost based on your life total. So it's sort of like the corrected Death Shadow card. There's other targets like that, and then you play Throes of Chaos in it to be able to get your Calibrated Blast and just kill somebody and you play a bunch of lands. That's like the normal plan for Calibrated Blast. Sorry, Calibrated Blast fans, if I missed anything there, but like that's how that deck works. This is a version that Ever mentioned that he wanted to try out using the idea of Witch's Cottage, which is a card from Eldraine that is the swamp version of that cycle of lands that lets you take a creature card from your graveyard and put it on top of your library. So the idea behind this deck, are you following me now, Stan?
Yes. I'm guessing you're putting cards into your yard with Spyro and Fable, then Witches cottaging like Shadow or Draco to the top to like basically build like a fling, build your own fling with Calibrated Blast.
Exactly. And that's exactly the idea behind this deck. Now, the thing that this deck gets to do that other ones don't get to do as a result of that is it gets to play cards that are actually castable cards for the most part and have some interaction. So you can play Lightning Bolt to get a little bit of extra damage. You can play Leyline Binding because you are already putting together a sort of fetch land dependent mana base based off of, it's essentially like the creativity mana base, but for swamps, right? So you're getting all these different cards that are, different triomes with the cross with the swamp, Blood Crypts, Godless Shrine, Witch's Cottage. It's all about getting up to enough swamps to make Witch's Cottage work, right? So as a result of that, you can play cards like Shadow Prophecy, Sign of Draco, and Leyline Binding, which are all domain cards. And they give you a chance to have some interaction through like Fury, but also potentially cast some of your cards. Like I definitely cast and won with Scion of Draco in the practice room and things like that. So you can sort of get together with this idea of I'm going to blast somebody and then I'm going to chip in for a bunch of extra damage. But while I'm waiting to blast somebody, I can Thoughtseize them. I can kill their creatures. I can play Seasoned Pyromancer or Fable to try to get value and kind of go from there.
I think this is the best utilization I've seen of Shadow Prophecy, which is a good and powerful card that needed a good application. And the fact that it both puts cards in your hand and lets you selectively put cards in your graveyard at instant speed, no less. Seems really nice for this type of combo in particular.
Yeah, and I think, that's sort of cutting to the punchline a little bit, Stan, for sure, because in my mind, when I played this deck, that was one of the main takeaways I've had is that I always thought that Shadow Prophecy was a good and powerful card. This card is fact or fiction when you have domain, except for it costs one less. There's no piles. You get to decide what goes where, even though you pay 2 life. It's still at instant speed and everything. I still think it's a little bit of like this deck I don't think is great. Like spoilers, I had fun playing it. I played these 2 decks. I decided to take one of them to a league. It was not this one, after playing it in tournament practice for a while. But I did like medium okay with this deck in tournament practice. I think I was probably like 2-3 or something in the practice matches that I had. And the plan works, but I don't think that it's powerful enough, even though it's the best like application of Shadow Prophecy. It didn't really feel like this deck was really coming together the way that I wanted to. And some of that was because of how hard it was to make the transition from the fair plan to the blast plan, right? Because you kind of have these two different card pools in your deck where you're kind of like, sometimes you want to draw Spyro, but you really only want to draw one, but then you Shadow Prophecy into another Spyro and a Fable, and you're like, well, I don't want any of these cards anymore. I don't need this. Or, you top deck a Thoughtseize late when you really don't need that kind of thing, which is a normal thing to have happen with Thoughtseize. But, and then other times you're kind of like, wow, I really need a Shadow of Mortality, but again, I only want to draw one. So there are those times where you get two Shadow of Mortality and you're like, this is terrible. Why do I have Shadow of Mortality in my deck? It's really a weird duality of these things of like, I want to draw this card, but I only want one of them, but I have to have four of them in it. So a lot of times you're sitting here with this deck, I felt like feeling like you're waiting around. And one thing I thought about this deck that I would try to see if it just helped or was interesting was, okay, well, Calibrated Blast costs 3 mana, it's an instant, and it has flashback. So if in the early game I'm running low on removal or I need to do something with my mana, like how bad is it to just Calibrated Blast in the dark and just see what happens as a piece of creature removal or even to do a little chip damage to an opponent? And let me tell you, after doing that a little bit, I sat down and thought about it for a minute and realized, well, here are the odds. If you ever think about playing this deck or about playing Calibrated Blast or just doing something like this without looking at the odds, there's 37 non-land spells in this deck minus 1 card for the blast that you're casting. So there's 36 cards in the deck, okay? There's 8 1-mana value spells main deck between Lightning Bolt and Thoughtseize. That's 22% of the time you're going to hit a 1-mana spell with this. There's 8 12/15 drops in this deck. That's also 22% to chance. So you're only really like 1 in 5 to hit one of your real payoffs with Calibrated Blast in the dark. It's not great odds. You're just as likely to hit a 1-mana card. After that, there's 7 5-drops in here between your Furies and your where's the other 5 drop? 6 drops really. Leyline Binding's the other one. And then you have 13 3-drops. So you're 37% to hit a 3-drop in the dark. You're most likely to hit a 3-drop when you do this. You'll do that more than a third of the time.
Why is that so bad, though?
So that's what I was going to say. As far as killing creatures in Modern, it's not too bad to hit a 3+ drop. As long as you keep in mind that you really should be trying to target things that have 3 toughness or less with this card, you can probably get away with using it as a piece of removal, and that happens 80% of the time. But 20% of the time you're going to brick and you're going to get a 1-mana card and you're going to feel bad about it. And that's going to be it. And it happened to me multiple times, so it's this weird thing where I think the RNG is okay. I'd mostly want to hold on to my blast as much as I could, but out of desperation, you can do this if you want. The other thing that I noticed about this deck, for what it's worth, as I was messing around with it in the tournament practice is, it's bad against both Graveyard Hate and Blood Moon, which is kind of a hard place to be because you don't have very many basic lands. You really need double black to cast Shadow of Mortality out of desperation, for example. Double red is good in the sense that you can get Blood Moon, but it turns off your Shadow Prophecy, your Leyline Binding, your Scion and Draco. You don't always get a chance to fetch up your 1 swamp. There's just lots of things that can happen here to make it difficult against Blood Moon. And then even worse, Graveyard Hate just pretty much completely destroys you.
Yeah. It's funny. You're only running 1 basic swamp main, and then you also have an extra basic plains on the side.
Yeah. Hey, this is Everett's list. So I was like, okay, I'm going to give this a try.
When do you bring in the planes? I honestly, I don't get it.
Against Blood Moon, I think.
But what are you
mostly against Blood Moon?
What are you using it to cast?
I think you want it for Path of Peril out of the sideboard and occasionally to hard cast a Leyline Binding, I guess.
But Path of Peril is black.
The cleave cost is 4 white-black.
Okay.
For what it's worth.
Okay.
So it can make you more likely to be able to cast it as a destroy all creatures as a wrath.
Interesting.
Instead.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
So one quick question about like the Witch's Cottage line, because Cottage doesn't, like, the earliest you can get Cottage to do anything is turn 4. If you have Blast in hand and you can get Cottage down on 4, let's say like you played the turn 3 Fable, turn 4 Cottage into Blast. do you just win right there? Like, is this a turn 4 deck?
If you can pull that off, you win maybe 2/3 of the time, I would think. Sometimes you have to get those extra 5 points of damage still. And so that becomes, okay, am I going to blast you again and hope to hit a 3-drop? Am I going to lightning bolt you? Am I going to attack you once or twice with Seasoned Pyromancer? Like, you got to close those extra 5 damage, and people don't always do it to themselves. So obviously this deck has turned out to, when I played it, was a bit better against decks that, do some damage to themselves with those. And conversely, was really bad against decks that have any kind of life gain in them. So if you have life gain and all of a sudden someone has 28 life effectively playing against you, it takes so much more effort to knock them down from there that it was really, really hard.
Well, I applaud you for trying this, Dave. It's funny and cool.
Yeah. Bottom line, I think it's a really cool built deck. It was an interesting idea. I love Everett's idea to say, like, let me go through the Eldraine lands and like try to build a mana base around those and use that mechanic, because as we know, being able to fetch these up is a thing that has led to a bunch of different decks happening. So, keep an eye on that, see where else he goes with that idea. I think playing Blast in this way is really cool. Fury is always an awesome card. As we said, this is the perfect deck for Shadow Prophecy, and that's a card I'm going to be keeping my eye on going forward just to find a home for it at some point. And having the ability to do mid-range in this combo is kind of interesting and fun, but at best for me, like on our scale, this is a believe. I would say it's like a believe minus, probably, honestly.
For sure.
The only reason it's even there is because Everett got a 5-0 with it, but okay. And then I have another deck to show you, Stan. I'm going to bring up another deck list for you to see. And that is by a player named Hank the Obese on Mono White Humans.
Yes.
In Modern. Now, this deck has been standing out to me lately. I mentioned it on our recap of Modern Challenges a few weeks ago. This one pilot, Hank the Obese, has gotten a 1st, a 3rd, a 7th, and an 11th. And I believe that the list that I'm looking at actually is another entry from this weekend that was a 10th place in a Modern Challenge at a 5-2. This deck is wild, okay? It's sort of like someone took the Pioneer Humans package and powered it up for Modern. All right, so here's what's in this deck. This deck is Mono White Humans. It's no Aether Vial, if you can believe it, when we're going this way. It's 4 Champion of the Parish, 4 Dauntless Bodyguard, 4 Esper Sentinel, 4 Luminarch Aspirant, 4 Talia's Lieutenant, 4 Adeline Resplendent Cathar, 4 Solitude, 3 Thalia Guardian of Thraben, and then 4 Chancellor of the Annex, 4 Shining Shoal, 4 Amaria's Call, and then lands that go with that, including 4 Mutavaults, 4 Caverns, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you're going to have to tell me what Chancellor and Shoal do.
So these are, of course, the strangest cards that are in the deck. Okay, so Chancellor of the Annex, this is part of that cycle from New Phyrexia. That what it does is you can reveal this card from your opening hand. It costs 7 for a 5/6 flyer. And it says, if you reveal this card, when each opponent casts their first spell of the game, counter that spell unless that player pays 1. And then it has a static ability on it. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, counter it unless that player pays 1. So this card is really there about taxing your opponent's first spell, trying to use that to be able to build up an advantage on your board. Okay?
Yep.
Shining Shoal, what it does is it says you may exile a white card with converted mana cost X from your hand rather than pay this spell's mana cost. And its mana cost is X generic white. And it says the next X damage that a source of your choice would deal to you and or creatures you control this turn is dealt to any target instead. So this card is super weird. And with the timing and the prevention effects and all that kind of stuff, I'm pretty sure that what this is in here for is this is a card that you can pitch one of your giant white cards to, like either Chancellor of the Annex or Amaria's Call, to direct somebody's fury somewhere else. Whether you want to direct it to one of their creatures, you want to direct it to fury, you want to direct it back to them, those are all things that you can do with Shining Shoal. And I have to say, because we're running out of time here, I played this deck a good amount. I think I played 10 rounds with this deck. And I did pretty well in tournament practice. This is one of those decks where like I did well in tournament practice, then I went and played a league and got just got absolutely housed.
Oh, yeah.
In a league, I lost to Scam, Murktide Creativity, Grizzlebrand, and Jun Saga. I went 0-5 with this in a league. After going like 4-1 with it against not completely different decks in tournament practice.
Right.
So I don't know if it's just bad timing or whatever, but I really wanted to like this deck. I love the idea of mono white being humans, number one, being a thing, but also mono white being something that someone can pull off in Modern. And of course, this person, Hank the Obese, is pulling it off in Modern with all these challenge finishes. They play mono white in pretty much every format. They're kind of like a mono white specialist, whether they're playing it in Vintage, they play it in Modern, they play it in Legacy, played in Pioneer, getting a lot of challenge results with all of it. This was just hard for me because all of these cards just felt like they just die in Modern constantly. Or you have these hands where you draw 2 Chancellor of the Annex and an Amiria's Call off the top as you're going through your game, and it's like, oh boy, I just have all these 7 drops and I'm never going to cast any of these. So it's tough. This is a deck I was excited to play and then just completely did not take off for me at all.
Yeah, this is a tricky one to evaluate because like it has the typical humans element of like Champion of the Parish, Dauntless Bodyguard, Esper Sentinel, Thalia's Lieutenant, right? Mm-hmm. Even Thalia itself. And then it has like Solitude, like good cards. Adeline, I guess, is fine. Like if you're curving out, it makes a lot of bodies eventually. I just don't understand, like, do you need Chancellor and Shining? Like, or even Amiria's Call?
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing from here. So like I love the design of this, like the idea of saying, okay, we're going to play Amiria's Call because we want to be able to pitch our lands. So we don't have to play more lands. We can put more cards in our deck, right?
Okay.
That's the idea.
Right.
And so you can pitch it to Solitude, you can pitch it to Shining Shoal, and that's great. It makes those cards turn on. Chancellor of the Annex, I don't really felt like I ever gained any tempo off of having it in my opening hand. And I would sideboard it out a lot and stuff like that. And it just felt like it wasn't really making an impact. And I had so many games, again, this might just be bad RNG, where it was like turn 5, peel Chancellor off the top, turn 8, peel Chancellor off the top.
Right.
You're just like, oh, great. What do I do with these?
Right. Like, and how good is the Chancellor effect in your opener even? It's basically just it's just a roadblock. Like it just tells your opponent, okay, like I can't play a Ragavan or a Thoughtseize on 1. I have to play it on 2 and you're just trying to
exactly.
like develop before then.
Yeah, and it lets you have a chance to play like Esper Sentinel into Luminarch Aspirant or something with your first 2 turns when they haven't had a chance to cast anything, essentially. So there might be that kind of thing here where, oh, well, yeah, you're supposed to take Chancellor out whenever you're on the play or something like that. You're only supposed to have it when you're on the draw or whatever, this pilot was thinking when they put the deck together. Obviously, I was just trying this out, so I didn't get a chance to really look at it. But that card really stood out to me a bunch of times as just being like, this doesn't feel like it's really happening for this to me.
It's also interesting to me that Chancellor's mana cost is the same as hardcasting Amiria's Call, so maybe they're just like your finishers.
Well, but this deck only has, so one version of it that I tried only had 16 lands in it, plus 4 Amiria Call. Mm-hmm. And then the other one had, this one that I'm looking at right now, it just had some updates for yesterday's challenge, has 17 lands in it, plus 4 Amiria Call. So, like, you're never getting to 7 mana. Like, almost never. I did one time playing this deck.
Well, you can play Amiria's Call as a land.
Well, yeah, of course, but that's what I mean. Like, you're never casting the 7 drops, so they're not really going to be your finishers. I mean, Amiria's Call, I was reminded a little bit from this building that, like, the idea of using the pitch lands with the pitch elementals is an interesting thing to be able to do, right? Now, you can't do that for every card.
Right.
Amiria's Call is maybe the best one of these because it goes with Solitude, et cetera, et cetera. But I just mostly left this feeling like I played this feeling like, oh, this should not be too difficult for me to try to get some momentum with. And then I just felt like every time I played Dauntless Bodyguard, it didn't matter. Every time I played Luminarch Aspirant, it didn't matter. Adeline was a little bit better, but really, like, then you get into the upper end things. Like getting tricky with Shining Shoal was not too advantageous often.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is one of those ones where I looked at it and I was like, this is going to be sweet. And then I would kind of like, and even after I played it in the practice rooms, I felt like this is actually pretty good. I can't wait to try it in a league. And then it was just like, here's 5 great decks in the format, or I should say 4 great decks in the format in Neo Brand. Neo Brand piloted by Azax, by the way. So I got roundly destroyed in that matchup.
Yeah, I wonder if there's like something to Shining Shoal that we're not picking up on, because Lawson Zandy has also been playing a Shoal deck, a different Shoal deck.
Yeah. Yes.
Very, very, like, it's not a humans deck. It's like a whole other plan. But like, if these two very different decks are playing Shoal, like, it's. I just feel like there's a trick to it that we're not picking up on.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I did get to do was like do 6 damage to someone off of a Murktide with it to like almost close out a game. So you can do that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah. And like Lawson again just posted a screenshot where he shoaled an infect opponent.
Right.
And I guess like maybe that's part of the appeal, is just like you try to trick your opponent into like overcommitting, and then you shoal them, and then you just like win out of nowhere.
Yeah. But anyway, I'm going to keep an eye on this and see if it keeps coming, because like I said, it would be nice if this deck did something in Modern. I think it would be good if Modern had a sort of tribal aggro deck like this. But, I couldn't pick it up and make it work just on my own over a weekend, I guess.
Oh boy, Shoal, $14 card.
Yeah.
As of last month. Prior to that, $1 card.
Right. It's happening.
Ooh.
It's already happening.
Yeah, so gotta buy it just in case.
All right. Yeah. All right, so this one I kind of just have as a believe as well, as far as our scale goes. So nothing that really stuck with me yet. Kind of just made me feel like I wanted to go back to playing the stock decks of the formats. But, you got to mix it up sometimes.
Yeah. What are you going to play next, Dave? If you're going back to stock, is it Scam and Hammer? Are you scammering?
Yeah, scammer time. It's scammer time.
Yeah. Well, good luck with that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this was fun. I liked our little hour segment. Efficient.
Yeah.
To the point. It's only half the show. I hope Shane and Devon's talked for 90 minutes, and now we're just giving people like the longest episode ever that isn't us doing 100 cards or 200 decks or what have you.
Yeah. And just breaking Tanner's heart.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we'll go back to the rest of the show.
Bye.
So Dave, as I mentioned earlier, I did that thing again where I went on, a little bit of a trip, a little bit of a business trip, vacation thing, and I'm not packing, a large puck of shaving soap. I'm not packing my brush. I'm not packing the safety razor. I'm scraping by with a travel bottle of like Gillette and a disposable razor, and I'm hating life like the 2 times I force myself to shave.
Sounds positively barbaric, Shane. How could you do this to yourself?
I'm a monster. So I come home and I'm a little bit ragged from not shaving as much as I usually do. And the first thing I do, of course, is shower at home. And this is no lie. I bust out the Barrister Mann, and my first choice this time, I felt in the mood for Le Grand Chypre, which is a part of the classic collection over at Barrister Mann. And what's cool about this one is everything. Every time I read one of these things, I'm always like, Will, you are a wild individual.
Lay it on me.
So he's like, here's the history of Chypres, y'all. This started in 1917
Sheep
by
or
Chypres.
Chypres?
It's Chypres.
What's a Chypres?
Chypre, and from perfume tycoon Francois Coty. He created the family in 1917. So it's indigenous to the island nation of Cyprus. And so, bergamot as of course. What is a fragrance without bergamot, my friends?
I think at this point, bergamot's been on more episodes than any of the rest of us have been on. It takes less weeks off. Bergamot never sleeps, Shane.
Regular guest host bergamot.
Yeah.
Lime, oak moss, touch of patchouli, elegant citrusy heart, peach, rose, frankincense, cedar, cinnamon, other supporting smells. Elegant, slightly fruity, freshly floral. That, I think, you get the idea that this is like, well, that's everything, right? And that's kind of the answer. That's one of the things I like about the Grand Chypre is it's like a little bit of everything. It's like a little bit citrusy. It's a little bit smooth. It's floral. It's fruity. And it's a total classic. I have the aftershave splash I have the shaving soap, and I would highly recommend it as part of the, just the thing that's always in stock. They always have the Grand Sheepra, and there's a good reason for it. It's because, it has 112 reviews with 5-star average. So people really like this one.
Yeah. Le Grand reviews.
Le Grand reviews. Yeah. So yeah, if you want to grab some of the Grand Sheepra, if you want to grab some of the recent additions to the Barrister Mann portfolio, I know that you guys mentioned Maryland last week. That's a popular and awesome scent. I love my sample of Maryland. Go to Barrister Mann, MANN. Use coupon code the Dive Down 2023, gets you 15% off your first order there. Let's Will and the rest of the crew know that you came through the Dive Down, and we appreciate your ongoing support. Devon, you're back again, the most regular co-host we have had in a long, long, long time. Welcome back.
Glad to be here. Yeah, I was actually talking on my stream. How many times do I have to be? How many times before I'm a special guest before I'm considered a regular guest?
I mean, you're regular guest host, Devon O'Donnell, also known as d00mwake. I saw you streaming today again. Saw some interesting Pioneer stuff happening. I saw the Storm Herald combo. Was that the thing? The deck you finished up with?
Yeah, we're maybe cooked a little bit too much with that one, but the goal is just to try and tap a 20 power, 23 power Storm Herald. There's a lot that has to go right, but maybe there's something there.
Yeah, I mean, is it literally like the Greasefang combo, where the combo is cast Greasefang, like just have stuff in your graveyard and cast the card and then you win?
Yeah, it's basically Greasefang if you took Parhelion, ripped it in half, and had to have two different pieces to actually complete the Parhelion adventure or whatever. Basically, you just need two Parhelions in your graveyard essentially.
But what's the advantage is that you don't die to artifact removal? Like, what else? What's the real draw here?
Well, you get to play blue and red cards, which means you get to play Ledger Shredder and Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Yes. And those cards are, pretty good cards.
So you get to play with other good cards, is what we're saying here. Yeah. Okay, good, got it. What we're going to talk about is a cool newer Pioneer deck, because Devon, I think that Pioneers felt a little bit static for a while. We didn't see anything particularly mind-blowing in the Pioneer Pro Tour besides maybe the cementing of creativity as a tier 1-ish strategy in the format. And I think that's pretty easy to say, or potentially easy to say. There's not too much new happening in Pioneer, even with all the focus on it recently. But then I say that, and I think that you probably have some other ideas, but one of the things I think that we would be overlooking is a newer addition to the format. And I think originally it was pushed forward pretty strongly by Todd Anderson, who also is a pretty prolific Pioneer streamer, primarily, if I can say other P words. So after the release of Phyrexia All Will Be One, he kind of pretty quickly put together a Golgari Sacrifice deck, or if you want to be a little bit more on the nose, Tyvar Sacrifice, right?
Right, yeah. And so basically this is, I worked on a lot of Tyvar shells. This is something that I necessarily didn't quite get to. But yeah, Todd was the first person that I saw playing this deck, like you said, a couple of weeks after release. And, he talked about, I want to say he 5-0'd a league right before the Pro Tour. And he's been super high on this deck. So yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, I think it was on February 14th or something like that, almost a month ago, he said the shell is really good. This could be a contender at the PT, but we didn't see that happen. People didn't really push the envelope too much, but I know people like Todd, people like yourself have kept pushing this deck forward and iterating on some of the important card choices, how the decks, what are the core pieces, what are the engine pieces, things like that. You recently took it to a 15th place finish on the March 5th challenge. I also noticed that the 12th place deck was a somewhat similar Golgari Sac deck, also featuring Tyvar, piloted by Hamuda. And, there's some significant differences there, of course, that we'll, talk about, but this is kind of like the Catacomb Sifter, which is just another card that can ramp you, but also just sort of creates two bodies across one card, things like that. This one had Bolas's Citadel, of course, which is just a different engine piece. But we're going to talk about the one that you've been playing. I think this is a good time to talk about this cool new strategy in Pioneer. What kind of, the usual, how this works, why you might want to be playing it, how it matches up against the other decks in the formats. And I think, I'm going to give you my spiel about how I think this deck works after, watching you play it, trying to play it a little bit myself. But what the deck seeks to do is play creatures that make multiple bodies, use sacrifice engines to kill these things off, and ping your opponent to death using these, the death trigger abilities of various cards in the deck. And then, meanwhile, you might be getting in some incidental attacks here and there. And you're creating a whole bunch of small creatures all the time in this deck. You can often block for value. And so that creates a really grindy nature of a lot of these sacrifice decks just sort of grind your opponent via chip damage from, cards like Zulaport Cutthroat, or in like Rakdos, you have things like the Cat Oven combo. So you can just sort of whittle your opponent down over the course of a game just through a bunch of your stuff and their stuff dying.
Right. One note.
Anything I missed?
Well, no. You got you're pretty good there. The one thing that I did want to mention, I did play a little bit with the Bolas' Citadel version as well, so I have an idea of kind of both versions. I actually kind of did like a mix of. I think the version that I had 2 Citadels and kind of some less numbers and some of the other less sifters and that stuff. But yeah, for the most part, it is playing what some people would describe as some really bad draft commons like Lazotep Reaver, which I will say is, a pretty good card in this deck. Maybe not the most prolific constructed card of its time. But yeah, just, put a bunch of stuff onto the battlefield, utilize sack outlets like Priest, Woe Strider, and things like that to kind of get a little bit of advantage that way.
Yeah, when I found myself ordering 4 Lazotep Reaper from the online marketplaces, because I so rarely get to the LGS that I didn't want to assume that they were going to have them. I just wanted to have them in my collection already. I was like, things have gotten weird. But yeah, I think that this looks like a lot of sacrifice decks that I've seen in the past. It's the kind of thing where when I watch other people play it, when I watched you play it, I'm always impressed by the quick decision-making ability that people like you, people like Todd, Spike plays a lot of kind of Rakdos Sac decks in Modern and things like that. And he's always, you're always generating lots of value out of these cards and kind of figuring out what's the best line for me to do the most damage. And that's where I get confused and where I get kind of a little bit overwhelmed, where it's like, well, do I play my Sac creation cards? Do I play my engine cards? Do I play, my Tyvar to try to get future value? And that's really why I wanted to get you on to talk about this deck, because one, you're doing well with it, and you know it a heck of a lot better than I do. But I do think that this is an interesting option in the format, and not just a curiosity, because I think that Tyvar opens up a really interesting outlet for playing these style of decks. We'll talk about what it brings to the deck. And also I think that it offers just sort of a different line of attack that has different strengths and I think probably weaknesses against the field on the whole than kind of the traditional Rakdos or Jund Sac decks that we've seen in the past.
So with Tyvar specifically, we never really had a Planeswalker that was truly good with a sacrifice, a Planeswalker that was good in the sacrifice shell. A lot of people want to talk about, a lot of people set up Nixilus the Adversary. I don't know if you remember the hype around that card. That was the next Oko Thief of Crowns.
That, yes.
But that one really never truly lived up to the hype. So the fact that we get a Planeswalker allows the deck to kind of have this different dimension where you can attack from different angles. You're getting value out of the Planeswalkers, still using the creatures. So it's, you're getting value out of a lot more different types of permanents as well.
Yeah. Speaking of Tyvar, let's just get into it. Let's talk about the Planeswalker in the room and get into the deck construction. And of course, this deck is running for Tyvar Jubilant Brawler. I feel like we talked a lot about this card in the past weeks. I don't want to repeat its abilities too much, but man, I feel like this deck extracts so much value out of the plus, the minus, and the static. You can activate abilities of creatures you control as though those creatures had haste. Sweet. The +1 untaps up to one target creature, and the -2 mills 3 cards. Then you may return a creature card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Starting loyalty is 3. So I feel like Tyvar isn't essential to the wins with this deck, but you do get advantage out of all these things. Like the static allows you to use your mana dorks immediately, but also a card I think we'll get into the weeds more on later, which is Priest of Forgotten Gods. You can use that immediately. The plus lets you untap something to use it again. The minus lets you get back something important that you might have had to sacrifice or was removed by your opponent at some point. So like, you're looking at something like Devoted Combo, which I talked about a couple weeks ago on the pod. Tyvar supports those surprise wins out of nowhere, and also offers some redundancy. I feel like Tyvar here is a bit of a different role, and that he creates just so much value out of so many different parts of your deck. Like, how do you find Tyvar performing in this deck?
Yeah, that's 100% correct. You're not really ever trying to, like, you're not going to win the game on the spot unless your opponent's at 2 life when you give your Priest of the Forgotten Gods haste. But what it does is, like you said, it provides this massive amount of value, being able to untap your Priest to get an extra activation. It mills 3, which not only can rebuy priests that were already killed, but if you don't have a priest in the graveyard, you can just YOLO and try to find a priest off of the top 3. Yeah. It also fuels additional cards for Woe Strider, because the escape on Woe Strider, I think it's 4, so it allows you to get more deeper into your graveyard for Woe Strider escapes. Sometimes if you have a Cutthroat in play and a Sac Outlet, rebuying a second Cutthroat can just be lethal on the spot, so it can also provide kills like that. Every single ability on this card is so massive with so many different cards. What it does is it kind of, normally with sacrifice decks, how they sometimes have these anemic draws where they have like you're playing Rakdos Sac and you have Mayhem Devil and no Sac Outlet, or vice versa. Tyvar kind of goes with so many different pieces. It's essentially like, it's basically a combo card with everything in the deck. When you have Tyvar, you're always going to have something to do with it, and that's the best part about it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because other 3-mana walkers that we've seen, if they're either they're really sort of synergistic with the deck's plans. Like, I think about kind of a pretty playable 3-mana walker in Nissa, who plus to make an 0/1 Dryad or something like that, or as a leaf token. I don't remember what that creature was, but
is Oko synergistic with its plan for 3-mana planeswalkers?
I mean, that's kind of where we get into the outliers, right? Where it's we have got Oko, we've got Teferi 3, which is sort of generic value, but then Teferi, of course, shores up particular matchups, especially in things like Modern, where it's you can't cast cascade spells, you can't do a lot of things that, in the control mirror, you can't counter people's spells. So that's really good value there. But Tyvar doesn't read like that on the face of the card. But it's then when you put it into a shell like this, again, similar to the Devoted Combo strategies where Tyvar does a lot there, I think you're exactly right. When you see it perform really well with nearly every card in the deck. And when you talk about even the slightly cruddy, draft fodder, it's good there. You get back a card that's making 2 bodies, you get 2 more sacrifice, potential sacrifice cards for your engines, and then you're doing 4 or 6 damage sometimes, and that's a lot for just a -2.
Right, and even sometimes,
of course, this is a Golgari deck.
And even sometimes when you're behind on board, getting back 2 blockers off of a Lazotep Reaver, or even just can be so important in those spots.
Right on. So Tyvar works with a lot of cards, and I think one of the primary class of cards, I guess, in this deck that I think it works well with is our mana dorks. And so, of course, we run the full 8 elves. We got the 4 Elvish Mystic, 4 Llanowar elves, and you kind of know what these do. Accelerate your mana. You want to play your 3-drop cards early. You can play your 4-cost spells more quickly. You can double spell more easily. You can leave up mana more easily. All that kind of good stuff that having more mana does for you. But then, like we said, the addition of Tyvar to this deck makes your elves even more powerful, because you can use them the turn they hit the battlefield, but you can also untap them to generate even more mana if you need. And I think in this deck, they do serve double duty as sacrifice fodder. So you have a few elves that are no longer super useful, then they're dealing 1 to 2 damage to your opponent, and that's a pretty good use of a 1-mana card.
Yeah, even with Priest too. There's a lot of times where I just go turn 1 Elf, turn 2 Priest, and as soon as I untap with it, even if I don't have another land in my hand, I'll just sack my Elves. Once you're untap with the Priest, because the Priest can get your mana back too. Another thing that's really not necessarily, well, like you said, giving the Elves haste, they can tap the turn that they come into play. It's very important because there's a lot of spots where, like, once you go, let's say you elf into Tyvar, and when you're activating Priest, you're drawing cards, but sometimes you need additional mana. So, like, the Elves being free, you can go, like, play an Elf, float a green mana, sack it to Priest, then get 2 more black mana, then you have 3, and you can kind of just, like, chain through your deck a bunch. So, even though, that doesn't necessarily, come at first glance, it's very important that they could tap for mana that turn.
Yeah. So let's talk about Priest of Forgotten Gods. I feel like Priest is one of your primary sack engines in this deck. It's a card that I remember being a thing when maybe it was when Historic was just getting going on Arena. And I remember there was like some Priest decks that were fairly popular there. And, especially in combination with things like Claim the Firstborn, I believe. And so what this card does is 1 in a black, 1/2. Shane, that sounds bad, but you can tap it to sacrifice 2 other creatures. Any number of target players each lose 2 life and sacrifice a creature. You add black, and draw a card. So, like, in a vacuum, this card feels powerful, but has tough restrictions, right? You have to have 2 other cards to serve as your sacrifice fodder, and you have to be able to untap with it after you play it. Right? Because it's a tap ability, it does not have haste. But if you're able to satisfy these conditions, like the card is doing so much work, right? Like you get the Edict. It's especially powerful against decks that aren't making a large number of threats against you. You force your opponent to lose 2 life. You get the 2 black mana out of it. You draw a card. That's just a lot for a 2 mana card.
Right, and then when you throw Tyvar into the mix, like you said, it kind of just mitigates, well, not mitigates, but basically removes those entire downsides. Tyvar not only allows you to activate it immediately, but it also, the -2 can rebuy a creature, which potentially could be 2 if you have a Lazotep Reaver. So, yeah, it's almost like Tyvar just, this card is hard to build with, but Tyvar kind of makes it effortless.
And I feel like Tyvar, like, sets up these big chains, like you were referring to a little bit earlier, where it's like, you use the Priest twice in one turn if you're able. And so you can do things like you make mana with the first Priest activation. You play another creature from hand, like a Lazotep Reaver or something like that, or a Woe Strider. And then you're able to, like, do that again. You combine that with your ping effects from those creatures dying. And you can have these turns where, like, your opponent's losing 8 or more life through, like, 2 Priest activations, depending on your board state. And that's a lot.
I've activated Priest 4 times in the same turn with this deck. You can get pretty crazy with it.
That would basically close the door. Yeah, I feel like Priest has been a card because of the fact that it's underpowered on its body, and it's a tap ability. Like, it's been one of those cards where it's like, this clearly has play just because of what happens when you activate that ability, right? But I think, like, the fact that, giving it haste and giving it the recursion ability from Tyvar is like this really interesting 1-2 punch where, they're like peas and carrots, right? Where it's like, if I've got Tyvar and I've got Priest and my opponent is not threatening me, really aggressively, like, I feel like I'm set up for a couple turns in a row.
Yeah, you just use it over and over and over again if they're not interacting with your Priest. And that's the other thing. It's, even if they do interact with your Priest, because that Tyvar provides it haste, you can even, like, most of the games where you have Tyvar and Priest, you're going to want to leave with Tyvar first, because then even if they have a removal spell in your hand, you play Tyvar, or you have Tyvar in play, you play Priest, even if they can't kill it, you get to activate it regardless. And then if they do kill the Priest, then you just get it back with Tyvar. So yeah, it just works so well together.
Yeah, it's like an interesting pinch on your opponent, right? Like, which is, like, I think something that when I hear higher level players talk about deck construction, or like why decks are particularly good, it's because they make the opponent have to make tough choices that neither are very good. Right. And, like, the situation you just presented is one of those where it's like, well, dang, like, I have to either deal with this Tyvar because of the ongoing value it's providing, but then I have to deal with a Priest at some point too. And either way I cut it, it's not great for me. And I think that's what I think is interesting about particularly this deck, and particularly, the addition of Tyvar, because, like, you look at this deck before Tyvar's in it, and it's like, sure, this is a functional shell of a deck, but, it's slow, it's mopey, it's not able to get a lot back out of its graveyard besides the Woe Strider with Escape, which requires 5 mana. And so you bring these abilities to the table, and suddenly you are making your opponent have to answer a lot more questions, and that's tough.
Yeah, and before Tyvar, a lot of these decks that we've seen they're more of like the Bolas' Citadel versions, where they're just on 4 Bolas' Citadel, 4 Collected Company, and just all creatures. And what Tyvar allows you to do, so Bolas' Citadel is, don't get me wrong, Bolas' Citadel is a powerful card, but it costs 6 mana. It's really hard to cast. So Tyvar kind of provides you a similar amount of value that Bolas' Citadel does in a 3-mana Planeswalker that's also harder to interact with. So before you had Priest would allow you to kind of jump the curve to get to Citadel. Now you don't even need the mana from Priest to get to your payoff. You just cast it for 3 mana.
Yeah, right on. I prefer paying 3 versus 6 for my engine pieces, for sure. All right, let's talk about another kind of Sac engine piece in Zulaport Cutthroat. You're running a whole playset of these, of course. I feel like most people know what this does. It's our 1 and a black 1/1, and when Zulaport or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Classic aristocrat sacrifice style card. You're just slowly kind of whittling your opponent down while buffering your own life total. And you're gaining that value from all your other Sac engines in the deck. And I feel like, I don't know what else to say about this card. Like, how high are you prioritizing having a Zulaport down versus other cards in the deck? Like, are you, like what's your thought on this in terms of, like, how essential is this in my opener? How essential is this for me to get on the board?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Shane. I actually think this is the worst card in the deck. And not necessarily, it's weird because the card is powerful and it does something very unique, but the problem with Zulaport Cutthroat, you never ever want to cast it early. It's basically always the last card you cast, because if you cast it early, your opponent trades for it and you don't have enough board presence to get a lot of damage out of it. So because it's the last card you cast, you're not really ever playing it early unless you absolutely have to, if you need a material to sack to a priest, but that's kind of like a last ditch effort kind of thing. But the card, it does what it does. It does gain a little bit of life. It can kill people out of nowhere if you draw 2 copies or Coco into 2 copies. If you have 1 in play and 1 in your graveyard, you can rebuy the other one with Tyvar. So it does close the game, but it's more of the closer. It's like closer towards the top end.
Sure. So like what, you're kind of like setting up a board state that then allows you to play a Cutthroat and just get a lot of sort of life loss from your opponent all at once, like kind of like in big chunks.
Right, especially against the removal heavy matchups. If you play, like, if your curve is, say, let's say you have like a Lazotep Reaver, a Woe Strider, a token, an elf, and all these like small, random, unplayable creatures in play that none of your opponents don't want to kill those cards. And then you put a Cutthroat on the stack, they're like, oh, well, either, they basically have to kill the Woe Strider on the spot. If you have a second Sac outlet, then that doesn't matter. But yeah, it's like they can't respond to the Cutthroat. You know what I mean? It's like they have to use the removal spell. They can't use it on the Cutthroat. And then, if you have another Sac outlet or if you can rebuy the Woe Strider, then you just kind of kill them all in one shot. So,
yeah. We have another similar card to Zulaport Cutthroat, and this is new. This is from Phyrexia Olby 1, I believe. I sure hope so. I'm going to sound silly if it's not. But there's Vran, Executioner, Thane. There's 3 of them in this deck. I feel like this is one of the cards that's slowly been getting more respect from players of this deck, and it's a legendary Phyrexian Vampire. It's a 2/2. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control die, each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. This ability triggers only once each turn. So it's another kind of, Zulaport-y, sacrificey kind of effect, but triggers only once each turn, I think makes people afraid of this card. It seems pretty underwhelming. But how do you feel like this card actually plays out in practice?
And myself included, I was one of those people. I don't know if you guys talk about. I don't remember you guys talking about this one during spoiler season.
No, I think we were just kind of like, seems kind of mopey.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure you probably read it and you said the same thing that I did. You read that last line of text and it immediately turns you off of it once each turn. But the thing about it is, it's once each turn, not once each turn cycle. And if you have a Sac outlet in play, a Priest or a Woe Strider, you can get the 2 on your turn and the 2 on their turn. So it's effectively 4 each turn cycle. So that's the important part about it. It wouldn't be playable without Sac outlets. The nice thing about this is it's better in low resource games than Zulaport is, because if you have a Strider and a Vrand but not a ton of other stuff to sacrifice, and you're like sacrificing one creature each turn cycle to that Strider, then you're getting more damage out of the Vrand that way, but you're losing less material in the process. So if you're ahead and you have a massive board, Zulaport's going to be better. But if you're playing those kind of, those 1-for-1 games against Rakdos where they're killing all of your stuff and you're lower on resources, Vrand's a lot better in those games.
Yeah, I feel like it's easy to find yourself like in best case scenario mentality where like, yeah, I'm always going to have like 4 cards to sacrifice to my, to sacrifice. I'm going to get 4 Zulaport Cutthroat triggers. Isn't that just generally better than Vran? And then you play the games out for real and you're kind of, you're nickel and diming your opponent with like, sacrifice here, sacrifice there. And then just the sheer efficiency of the 2 life per on Vran just sort of makes up for it, right?
Yeah, and, like I said, requiring less material, because if you want to sack one creature, 2 creatures every turn cycle, you'd be getting, 2 triggers off of the Zulaport, 1 on your turn, 1 on your opponent's, versus the, effectively one Vran trigger, which is worth 2 Cutthroat triggers, essentially, so. And, it being a 2/2 is somewhat relevant as well.
Yeah, for sure. Like, it does block a little bit better. It's a legendary, so it's potentially a drawback there, but I feel like this is the card I've seen move from like, 1 or 2 copies up to kind of 3, I think is where people are saying, yeah, like I like Vran enough. I like Vran as my engine piece that it's going to go in there. I want one on the board.
I want to play the 4th copy too. I'm thinking about it.
I mean, how bad can it be? It's a removal target. Like, it's
the nice
and I
thing
think
is,
this is the kind of thing too, like if you play it, and the legendary thing goes on, the trigger goes on the stack, then you just sacrifice the other one.
Yep, I was just going to say that. Yeah, even if you don't have a sack outlet, if you legend rule, keep the new, even if you've already triggered the first, that's another important part. If you have it so if you have a Vrand, you've triggered it, and you play a second Vrand and you keep the new Vrand, that new Vrand is still going to trigger. Yeah, and it's going to trigger off of the legend rule dying from the other one, so.
That's fine with me. I would play 4. Let's just do it. Let's just try it out now. Let's leave up. Let's get in the.
You want to fire up a league? Is that the new podcast content?
Yeah,
we're going to play leagues on the podcast.
Let's see. What's that opening sound that happens every time you patch? Wow.
Oh, you play with sounds? No, I can't play with sounds.
No. Like you turn sounds off, and then every time you patch and you load it up again, then like the sounds
forces it on you.
I don't know, man. And the foil animation. Okay, so there's kind of our engine pieces. We got our priests, we got our cutthroats, we got our Vrans. Let's talk about our fodder makers. 4 Woe Strider. Again, these are cards like I know them for some reason. Like maybe I played them in limited, maybe I played them like in early Pioneer decks, but like I feel like people don't even know what this card does anymore. It's 2 and a black, 3/2, creature horror. And when it ETBs, it makes a 0/1 white goat creature token. Here's the important part. Or one of the most important parts, sacrifice another creature, scry 1. That's it. It has just a static ability to sacrifice another creature. You don't have to pay any mana. You don't have to tap it. It's just a sacrifice engine. And then also another important thing, the escape clause. 3 black, exile 4 cards from your graveyard, so you have the 4 cards right, and then it escapes with 2+1/+1 counters on it, makes 2 bodies, gives you that instant speed sacrifice ability. The scry 1 is great just to get you through your deck, find the needed cards when you're also kind of doing what you want to be doing, which is sacrificing. The escape helps you grind. I just feel like, when I watched you play the full league of this deck, like I saw you escape it like a surprising number of times.
Yeah, it comes up a lot, especially because there's going to be situations where you have let's say you're playing a little bit of a longer game and you have Priest, but you top deck a Woe Strider and you want to activate the Priest, but you have nothing else in play. Then you can just go, Priest, sacrifice the Woe Strider and the Go token, make 2 black, and then you probably have 3 other mana to be able to just immediately escape the Woe Strider. Very important against Rakdos because, again, the games get grindy, they kill all your stuff. Really important to be able to escape that. And yeah, it just comes up a decent amount because of the fact that, Priest makes 2, Tyvar untap Priest, that's 4 mana right there. It doesn't really require a ton of extra mana to be able to escape it. And just being able to leverage the ability to sacrifice the Woe Strider itself to the Priest can be important. Now, sacrifice outlets are so important in this deck that, specifically ones that don't require additional mana, unconditional sack outlets. So Priest is good, but you have to tap it. It's limited. You can only sack 2 things. I've actually been considering playing 1 or 2 copies of Nantuko Husk, even though the sacrifice ability is not terribly relevant. It's 3 mana 2/2 sack a creature, get +2/+2 until end of turn. Just the ability to just put stuff into your graveyard is really important in this deck.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Like I remember like in sacrifice deck construction, it's really all about finding the sacrifice enablers where it's like, what do I not have to pay for? What can I do at instant speed? What can I do in response to my opponent targeting my creatures with removal by casting a Wrath against me? And Woestarter just ensures you against so many of those situations where it's like, yeah, I'm going to lose all my stuff. I'm going to get a lot of value out of it in the meantime.
Yeah, Watsy, if you're listening, please give us Goblin Bombardment and Pioneer.
All right, and then we're talking about some truly innocuous seeming cards. I guess is what we were forced to run in Pioneer. We've got Lazotep Reaver, 1 in the black, 1/2. When it ETBs, you amass 1. If you remember this mechanic, it makes a zombie army creature token with a 1/1 counter on it. So the idea is if you had other amass creatures that would amass 1, amass 2, you would add counters to your existing zombie army. It's a single creature token that gets larger with amassing. That's not really what you're doing here. You're not really going to amass a large army. You just want to have 2 creatures, 2 bodies, 2 pieces of cardboard or digital cardboard if you're playing a Magic Online for 2 mana.
Right. Yeah, that's the most important part. I'm sorry, I was typing in the background. I just wanted to see. I looked up War of the Spark draft orders to see about where it was in the draft order, and it said it's in the tier of sometimes playable. So sometimes playable, limited, but perfect for our deck and constructed. Yeah, the most important part about this is 2 bodies. Amass is awkward, where if you have the army token in play and you play a second Reaver, it doesn't work. You just get a +1/+1 counter. So ideally, you want to utilize that token before you play a second Reaver. But yeah, 2 mana, 2 bodies. The stats don't matter too much. Just material on the battlefield. That's all we're looking for here.
Sure. And then this is a new addition. It was not in your deck list on your VOD from like about 10 days ago or so. 2 Cult Conscript, which is just a black 2/1 skeleton warrior. ETB's tapped, so kind of like a Gutter Bones type thing. But for 1 in the black, you can return it from your graveyard to the battlefield, and you can activate this only if a non-skeleton creature died under your control this turn. So I feel like this is just a cheap recursive creature and doesn't require you to attack, right? So this is just kind of like value. It doesn't require you to get damage in, doesn't require the opponent to lose life. It's just like, hey, I'm getting this back pretty easily.
Yes, so this card is a somewhat recent addition, and there's a couple of things going on here. So entering the battlefield tapped, a little bit awkward because it can't block the turn that you play it. The really nice thing, there's a couple of things going on here. First and foremost, the ability on it, a lot of times you'll see this on these creatures that return from the graveyard. A lot of them only trigger on your turn. So you think what's the one with Raid? It's like Bloodsoaked Champion where you attack. Obviously, you're not attacking on your opponent's turn unless something weird's going on. But because this can return to the battlefield on your opponent's turn, you can say, in combat, you can go block with it, tap the priest, sack it, and then you would get the thing about it too is you get 2 mana from priest. So it works out perfectly where you get the 2 mana from priest, which you wouldn't normally be able to use mana on your opponent's turn, but you can use the 2 mana right into the conscripts. And it's just so perfect with priest because if you don't have extra stuff to do with that mana, just return the Cult Conscript, and you can do it over and over again. So in the instance where you go like priest, sack conscript, do the thing, 2 mana, get it back, Tyvar, untap priest, sack conscripts, get 2 more mana, 2 mana, bring it back. I'm in love with the card. I kind of want to play a third.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I didn't catch that part because in my mind, like you said, I'm comparing it to Bloodsoaked Champion, I'm comparing it to Gutter Bones, and then you look at it and you're like, oh, wait, this just makes so much sense with what the rest of my deck is doing, especially with your powerful Priest of Forgotten Gods board setups where, like you said, I'm getting the mana anyway. This just lets me have a really nice recursive piece of cardboard that lets me do what I want to be doing. And I think it's great. I love it. Let's talk about Coco, because I feel like this is a big get for this deck over some other sacrifice decks. We could Collected Company, value and selection. the classic reason that one would play Collected Company. You can cheat on mana. You get like 5 or 6 mana's worth of cards for 4. But what I think is really more important potentially for this deck is it gets you a needed piece of the puzzle, right? Like whether it's a sacrifice engine, like a cutthroat, or like a fodder maker, like your Woe Strider, it gets the ball rolling. Like Coco allows you to find those. And like for a deck like this, like breaking on lands for a few turns, or getting like a creature you just really don't care about when you just really need to to have 2 bodies. Yeah, I think this makes so much sense in the deck, and it just is a really big reason to be in a strategy like this, right?
Right. Rakdos Sacrifice is a deck that people have played in the past, but that deck doesn't have green cards, and Collected Company, and whenever a deck has Collected Company in it, it's always going to be the best card in the deck. And this is no difference here. This is, far and away the best card. Like you said, just the selection is kind of the most important part. If you have a Woe Strider and you're missing a priest, you can have a Tyvar in play, which gives you priest haste anyways. So just, not a ton else to say about this card, but it's just so good. Particularly important, like you said here, against the control decks. Just being able to hold up Collected Company gives you more flexibility, more selection. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like a lot of decks don't want to play against Collected Company in this format. Like, Rakdos doesn't want to see the value, doesn't want to see you select the right cards that it then has to deal with later with more removal. Control decks don't want you to recover from their wrath. They don't want you to be playing, at their end step necessarily. You can get counter magic out of their hands and then untap and play other stuff that you also perfectly happy casting. So, Coco is a card that I've loved casting for years. And I mean, whoever casts Coco loves casting it. I mean, that's just a fundamental truth of Magic, I feel like, at this point.
Well, except for when you take 6 lands and put them in the bottom of your library. But the upside is you have to remember when that happens, you're not drawing 6 lands in a row. So there's always a positive.
I mean, how many creatures do you play in this deck? We're playing 29. Our odds are very good to hit creatures. Why? Because it's like around 30 creatures you want to be playing in like a Coco deck typically, right?
Yeah, 30 to 32. We're close enough.
Yeah, so what's funny is in the deck list that you played a couple weeks ago, there was a Singleton Bastion of Remembrance, which is like a 2 and a black enchantment version of like a Zulaport Cutthroat that also gave you like a 1/1 human creature, and you were saying this is a little bit overcooked. We're not playing this card.
A little bit overcooked. I mean, I thought it was good in theory as a 1-of, because the nice thing is specifically against Rakdos midrange, they're not really good at removing enchantments from the battlefield.
Exactly.
The issue is it's not a Coco hit, so I think I'd rather just have a 30th Coco hit, either the 3rd Conscripts or the 4th Fran. Probably would lean towards the 3rd Conscripts, but yeah, I think that's more important as an additional Coco hit.
I mean, that gets into like one of the things that I think a lot about when I'm looking at deck lists like these or playing with them is like, what is the balance that I'm hoping for in the stuff I'm sacrificing and the things I'm using to sacrifice, right? Where it's like a lot of the times the balance isn't, it's not a 1/1 ratio, because you're hoping to sacrifice the sacrifice engines, the sacrifice fodder perhaps more often than anything else. So it's like, well, do I want more of those? And do I hope my opponent's not going to remove the engine pieces? I need to stay on the board for me to do anything at all. And I think that's the kind of stuff that we've seen be iterated upon over the past like 4 weeks of this deck's existence, is kind of like what makes sense, what feels right about the balance here. How are these games playing out? Have you noticed anything in kind of the games you're playing where it's like, I wish I had more of X and less of Y, and you've adjusted?
It happened a little bit more when I was playing the version with Bolas' Citadel, because I trimmed on Coco hits a little bit to make room for the Citadels. I think the list that I played had 4 Tyvar. I think I even trimmed a Coco. I think it was like 4 Tyvar, 3 Coco, 3 Citadel, or something along those lines. And I think I even might have trimmed a land. But the issue with doing stuff like that is when you start trimming lands or you start trimming Coco hits, then you just make your deck a little bit more inconsistent. So I think at the end of the day, you're adding a little bit of power, but you're kind of taking too much away from the rest of the cards in the deck. And this whole entire deck is it's solely based on synergy. It's just the most synergistic deck in the format. So when you start having these like hands that are a little more anemic, that have too many pieces of X and not enough pieces of Y, and especially not enough lands, then you end up in these spots where the powerful cards that you're adding don't actually accomplish anything because they don't work and you can't cast them. So,
Yeah, right on. I guess we'll briefly talk about the mana. So this deck isn't hugely mana hungry and has 8 mana elves, so you can play around 22 lands or so. I think has looked really good. Has it been good in your experience?
I think 22 is right. The reason that I like 22 a lot is because I frequently will just sacrifice my elves to priest if I untap with priest. So that's why I don't mind. I think the correct number of lands with this curve and elves is probably 21. But there's 2 reasons, again, as we talked about, I like sacrificing the elves to priest. And then the other thing is the 22nd land is that Westvale Abbey, which is, another mana sink.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's important in a deck like this, especially in a format like Pioneer, right? Where it's your mana dorks are dying a lot, I think. And whether it's by your own hand or by your opponent's removal spells. And so I think it's really valuable to not get greedy in your mana. And the more I hear experienced players talk about deck building, they're always let's just add some more land. Let's just make this deck run more consistent. I mean, there's mana sinks in this deck. There's a lot of stuff that you can do. And the mana in this deck, I think, is quite good. You get the full playset of fast lands, pathways, pain lands, and shocks. The pathways do seem like the worst land in the deck. That's not a basic because it's you very often are this is takes me back to playing Gruul aggro in standard a long time ago where it's I want turn 1 Elvish Mystic, turn 2 something with green red pips where it's I have to have green turn 1 and red turn 2 or I'm screwed. And there's a lot of reasons that wouldn't happen. But here the mana just seems so good. You get a few basics. You get tech lands like Takenuma, like Boseiju. In your list, I see an Urborg and a Westvale Abbey, and I feel like Westvale Abbey, all you have to do is get to 5 creatures and 5 extra mana, and Westvale Abbey seems pretty reasonable, right?
Yeah, I think in the challenge and the couple leagues that I played the Abbey in, I think I've only activated. I haven't gotten to flip Ormondal, and I think I've only made one or two tokens off of it. It doesn't come up that often, but there were several games where if I put myself in a position where if I was able to draw it, that I would have been able to make an Ormondal. It's one of those things that it's rarely going to come up, but when it comes up, it's the difference between, flooding out and just winning the game on the spot. The one thing that I will say about the pathways, if you look at the deck list, it's almost like a mono black deck splashing elves. So yeah,
exactly.
The pathways are a little sketchy in this deck, but I think you do want to play them.
Yeah, I think you have to. I mean, I don't know what else you do. I mean, you're going to play some more basics. There's no other, you're not going to play a slow land or check land or anything like that. So is there any consideration of something like Castle Lochthwain here, where it's just I need more cards and I have mana and I have time? Or do you think the other tech lands like Takenuma or something like that or an Urborg are just better?
I think if you wanted to play a card like Castle Lochthwain, you'd probably have to cut the Westvale Abbey. I don't really see... The Urborg is important to make your green pathways tap for black. The Boseiju and the Takenuma, I think, are too important, and I think you want one of each basic. So, the only thing I could consider cutting is the Westvale Abbey. But the other thing about Castle is you really only have 6 swamps in this deck. You have 4 tombs, a basic, and an Urborg. So yeah, it's not it's not guaranteed to come into play on tap, which is kind of awkward.
Yeah, that's a good thing to remember is the tapping nature. All I think about is, what's my ongoing value here, but not how bad is this hindering my initial curve if I'm not able to play it. So yeah, good call.
Yeah, and curving out with this deck is so important.
So let's briefly talk about the sideboard. I think we can talk more about the sideboard when we talk about kind of mashup stuff. So we've got, typically it's pretty streamlined where you have a Jegantha as the companion. You run 4 Fatal Push, 4 Thoughtseize, 3 Canker Bloom, 3 Scavenging Ooze. My kind of sideboard. Very to the point, very targeted. You don't have a lot of odds and ends. Just what do I want to do when I'm facing certain types of decks and I'm going to bring these things in. How important is Jegantha in this deck, do you think? Jegantha.
Should we just call it Jenga from now on?
We like the soft J sometimes here on the pod. It's just Jegantha.
I think it's pretty important. There are a couple of games, especially because the ability of Priest of Forgotten Gods jumps you up the curve a little bit. So you could imagine a spot where it's like turn 4 or turn 5, you activate a priest, all of a sudden you just have 8 mana. And that's enough to just pick up and play Gigant in the same turn. So I think it's pretty important. It mostly comes up against Rakdos. When you're racing, it's not terribly important, but it can be the difference between winning and losing against Rakdos.
Yeah, it's like you have the room. Clearly, this is not a sideboard that like has a bunch of little random one-ofs. So I feel like those are the kind of sideboards you can usually find in the room for, a card as powerful as any playable companion that's unbanned still is. Okay, so we talked a lot about kind of the makeup of the deck, like how you're thinking about some of these cards. Like, let's talk about actually playing this out. And like, I think one of the first things that I like to think about when I'm picking up a new deck is what am I looking for in my opening hands? And like, what are the kind of things that you're doing when you're making your mulligan decisions?
So I kind of like to break the deck down into like a couple of categories. So the first one is the power cards. These are Tyvar, Priest of Forgotten Gods, Woe Strider, Collected Company. These are kind of like the cards that are going to lead you to the most amount of wins because they generate the most amount of value, and they actually contribute towards they're just like cards that either provide multiple things, multiple resources, or just your most powerful cards. Then the supporting cast, which are like your elves, your Lazateps, and your conscripts. So your the foundation, where in the case of elves, where you're jumping the curve, you're building a foundation of a mana base, and then you have the Lazatep Reavers and conscripts, which are the stuff that help fuel your power cards, stuff like Priest, stuff like Strider. And then the finishers, which are the Vrans and the Zulaports. These you really don't necessarily want to see those in your opening hand. Those you'd rather see like turn 3, turn 4, or off of a Coco. The most important thing is you can't really keep a hand that doesn't have a power card. Like if my hand doesn't have Tyvar, Priest, Strider, or Coco, there's almost no circumstance I would keep that hand. So you want to at least have 1 to 2 of those cards. Some foundation to build upon. It could be elves. It could be like if you have a Tyvar, you want elves. If you have a priest, then you want Lazatep, stuff like that. You want whatever puzzle piece you're missing to match the power card that you have. So yeah, those are kind of that's kind of what you're looking for.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So like, I feel like it's tempting in a deck like this to be like, I have a mana elf, and I have a turn 3 play, right? Or like, or I can cast 2 2-drops on turn 3 or something like that. But I think like you're totally spot on, which is like I need my pieces to work together. It's like it's a synergy deck. And just keeping those synergies in mind, because like you said, like you can quickly find yourself in a place where you're just like, well, I have a couple 1/1s and a couple more 1/1 tokens, or I have a 2/2 zombie army, and I'm not very happy with myself.
Yeah, like for example, imagine an opening hand that's like Llanowar Elves, Lazatep Reaver, Vran, Zulaport Cutthroat, 3 lands. That's a hand that has lands and spells, but it literally doesn't do anything.
Yeah, and what are you looking for in that particular situation?
I'd be looking for 6 cards.
Oh, and so if I remember the cards you said, I didn't hear a sacrifice engine card in there. Nothing that actually sacrificed, right?
Cards. That's basically that hand was just 2 finishers and 2 supporting casts. And the thing is that hand just doesn't go anywhere. You can't afford to keep a hand like that because your cards, like your power cards, are great, but you could like in theories like justify keeping. Well, it's like, well, what if I draw the power card? But what if you draw the wrong power card? Like you keep that hand and you draw a Tyvar. Tyvar's not that great with that hand, because you don't really, you know what I mean? It's like you want to make sure that you have the right supporting cast to go with the right power card because the piece of the puzzle got to fit together.
Yeah, especially in a deck like this where all of your creatures are pretty underpowered. So you're relying on the damage not coming through the combat step, but coming through just their innate abilities and like static text and things like that.
Right. Exactly.
So what does like the game look like for you? Like, I know it's of course going to depend on the hand, but like how do most games that you're playing with this deck seem to play out?
So I think the best start that you can possibly have is turn 1 elf, turn 2 Tyvar. Nothing is really going to top that. The reason for that is you don't have to expose your other pieces early to removal. Like if you go elf into priest, yes, that's powerful, but you're exposing yourself to the fatal pushes to the bone crusher giants of the world. Whereas if you go, if you're on the play and you go elf into Tyvar, maybe they kill your elf. You don't really care because you're going to untap with Tyvar, and you have, you can maybe go like play an elf, play a priest, do some stuff there. Also, like Tyvar allowing you to play multiple elves. You can go like turn 1 elf, turn 2 Tyvar, untap your elf, play another elf. Keep going, just put as much stuff onto the battlefield. And then sometimes where like the games where you don't have Tyvar, then you're kind of like maybe nothing on turn 1. You kind of will, if you have a Tyvar, then you probably can afford to, like my general philosophy is if I have Tyvar in hand and I'm not feeling like I'm going to be under pressure, like if I don't have to close out the game quickly, and I'm playing against like Rakdos or something, I'm going to wait a turn to play that priest. Like if my hand, let's say my hand is like, let's say I'm on turn 2, I can play a Reaver or a Priest, but I have a Tyvar in my hand, I'm going to play Reaver that turn, because then I can go turn 3 Tyvar, and then wait until I have the Tyvar on the battlefield to play the Priest. If I don't have Tyvar, then I'll usually play the Priest and just kind of cross my fingers, hope it doesn't die. But little things like that, that's kind of what the games look like, where you are just trying to kind of amass a bunch of resources, utilize Priest, and just kind of go from there.
Yeah, so like at some point, do the resources stop mattering as much? Like, what kind of board states are you trying to configure sort of like mid to end game? Where it's like, is it kind of like we talked about before in the Zulaport Cutthroat area, where it's like, hey, if I have like 4 pieces of cardboard and a Woe Strider, and I'm just sort of like trying to set up a position where maybe I'm activating Priests of Forgotten Gods, like, and then I am hoping to use Woe Strider using Woe Strider to like eventually draw into like a finishing piece, like a Zulaport or something like that. Like, how do you get the opponent like really down from 20 to 0 in a deck where your creatures have like literally 1 and 2 power?
So this is where we get to everybody's favorite part of the podcast, where we talk about math.
Okay, so, give me some math.
You want some math? Well, essentially what you're trying to do is basically you want to activate Priest as early and as often as you can. Sometimes, even if your opponent doesn't have a creature in play, I just want to activate it so I can churn through my deck and find those win conditions. Ultimately, what you're doing is you're getting some chip shot damage. Sometimes you have an early Cutthroat, sometimes you have an early Veranda, you're getting a little bit more chip damage in there. But the end game that you're playing towards is you're trying to find a Coco or maybe 1 or 2 Zulaport Cutthroats, just a massive battlefield, and then basically you're just adding up, can I kill my opponent if I have, Woe Strider, Zulaport, and 8 or 9 creatures? Is that lethal? Do I have a second Cutthroat? You know what I mean? Stuff like that. That's the end game that you're building towards. And really early, what you're utilizing Priest to try to keep them off the balance a little bit. They have to sacrifice creatures if they have creatures, and you're getting chip damage in while kind of keeping them off balance a little bit. So that's kind of the short game, and then that long game is those finishers like Zulaport and Fran.
How do you try to bridge the early to the late, mid to late game? Because I feel like a lot of times you're going to find yourself under particular types of pressure, whether it's the pressure from your opponent keeping like what they would hopefully have a decent opening hand that they would bother keeping, whether it's enough aggression in like a red deck, or enough of a synergy with their Grease Fang, or enough kind of creatures and interactive spells and like Rakdos. Are you willing to put creatures into harm's way to like buy you time? Are you willing to kind of like put stuff out there on the battlefield to eat a removal spell and just say, hey, this Coco in my hand is going to make up for all of this, or something like that? Like, how do you, like, what's your thought process for, getting early to getting mid and then being able to grind?
Kind of depends whether or not you're under pressure. Like you mentioned example, like if you're playing against the red deck, in general, I think that as long as you can get to those later stages of the games where you start casting Cocos, you start flashing back Woe Striders, you start Tyvar Untap Priest, once you've gotten to that stage of the game, your deck is a lot better. Like, you just have more powerful cards at that point in the game, so you just want to buy as much time as possible against, like, the White Wheaties and the Mono Reds of the world. You're playing against Lotus Field, say Lotus Field, for example, you just need to be as quick as possible, so you just want to have, and that's kind of awkward because your deck can't kill that fast, but if you have, say, like a Priest and 1 or 2 Cutthroats, you can actually, get a somewhat fast kill, especially if you throw a Woe Strider in there. So it really all depends on, like, what kind of pressure you're under, whether it's your opponent pressuring your life total, or if you're under a time management kind of pressure, where that's kind of how you bridge into that. Most of that is all kind of tied together by Coco, where the nice thing is it's like a perfect mid-game card because it's, right around turn 4, and it finds you whatever piece you're missing, or if your opponent has removed, pieces, or you've had to block with those pieces, then it can also find those pieces as well. Yeah,
that makes good sense. I feel like we're kind of bridging neatly into maybe some like matchup and sideboard card discussion. So like how are you addressing particular matchups? Like, what are you using some of your sideboard cards, and like how do you try to shore up or take care of some of the more popular decks in the field?
So it's going by the sideboard. The sideboard's pretty cut straightforward. Nothing too fancy going on there. The 4 Thoughtseize is we want these against spell-based combo. So Lotus Field, things like that, and then decks that have counter magic and sweepers. So you think like the blue-white controls, blue-black controls of the world. Because Thoughtseize is your best tool against like stuff. Basically, when you're trying to race. Because your deck isn't that great at racing, you just need to kind of take the best piece and try to pick apart their strategy. Yeah. Sweepers, you don't necessarily care as much about because you have a lot of backstops against that. Like you have the Woe Striders and you have the Cocos that you can kind of hold up when they go for a sweeper. Fatal Push, mostly here for aggressive decks when they're trying to attack your life total, you want Fatal Push, and also against Rakdos, you kind of want Fatal Push for Graveyard Trespasser. That's probably the scariest part of the Rakdos matchup, is because that card, it can mess with Tyvar in the sense of they can just get your Priest or whatever the best card in your graveyard is at that time, and it also exiles Woe Strider, which is one of your most important cards against Rakdos. Canker Bloom is here mostly for mono green because you got to kill Pithing Needle. The way that the mono green matchup is tough. The way that you beat them is just Priest over and over and over and over and over again. Okay. And you need to be able to Canker Bloom.
To keep their battlefield empty.
Yeah. Well, and you can also try to race them because their deck isn't that great at like removing creatures from the battlefield. If you just have a Priest and an early Cutthroat, you pair that with a couple other creatures, you can drain them out pretty quickly. So that's kind of your
sort of like
there.
Block, sacrifice after block, stuff like that, unless they have the tramplers.
Right. Yeah, and then lastly, Scavenging Ooze is here for Phoenix and Greasefang, just graveyard strategies. It's the best thing that you can play against graveyard because it's a Coco hit, so I think it's the most important one.
Makes total sense. So how are you feeling against the field out there? Like, what kind of decks do you think you have good matchups, great matchups, terrible ones? Because that helps people kind of plan, like, hey, do I want to bring this into my local meta, like, or into a perceived meta, like an RCQ or something like that? Like, how do you feel this deck stacks up?
So the matchup that you're probably going to encounter the most is Rakdos, which is a good thing because I think the Rakdos matchup is favorable.
I mean, decks like this typically are, right? Like, you just have a lot of cardboard, a lot of things they got to deal with.
Right, yeah, Rakdos Sacrifice always had a good matchup against Rakdos mid-range. Maybe, well, I guess that's not necessarily true, because they used to play Kalitas. But thankfully, they printed this card called Shieldred, and nobody plays Kalitas anymore. So, as long as people don't start playing Kalitas, then you're fine. So yeah, I think that I like that matchup. The downside is Mono Green is kind of a sketchy matchup. I have played it, I think, 6 or 7 times now. I think I've won once. I didn't think it was going to be as bad early because, like, if they keep a hand that's reliant on Elves, you have the Priest, and they're not really good at removing Priest from the battlefield. The issue is when they keep hands that go turn 2 Haven, turn 3 Karn for Needle. Your Priest isn't interacting with those draws, and it's really hard to beat them when you can't activate Priest because it's hard for you to churn through your deck and generate the mana that you need to. Blue-white control, I think it's a close matchup. I have even on here. Maybe it's like slightly in their favor, but again, you have Woe Striders, you have Collected Companies, you have a lot of value against them. So I think that matchup is okay. Greasefang, incredibly good matchup. The reason is all you have to do against Greasefang, just take Priest and just never tap it on your turn. As long as you just leave your Priest in play, it's really hard for them to ever go for a Greasefang, especially post-board once you have Fatal Push to clear their other smaller creatures, because sometimes they can have like Satyr Wayfinder or Rafine's Informant into Greasefang to kind of have like a body blocker.
Yeah.
But post-board, you get Fatal Push for that too. Boats, another really good reason to play this deck. You have a very good Boats matchup. Just, again, your lineup of Priest and whatnot against their Elves, it's a tough matchup for Boats. Lotus Field, I don't really know how you ever beat this deck in a million years.
Yeah,
I wrote down on here, please dodge. You don't really have a fast enough clock against Lotus Field. So if you got a lot of Lotus Field, don't play this deck. Creativity, that's another matchup that I don't have a ton of experience in. The one cool thing about the Creativity matchup, similar to the Greasefang matchup, is now it's a lot tougher against Creativity because they have, 8, 9, 10 ways to kill your Priest. But Dream World, Dream Scenario, if you have Priest in play and you have it untapped on their turn and they go for Xenagos Worm, then you just Priest them, they sack their Worm, and you don't take 30 damage. Now, the issue is you still have to beat 3 5/5s, which might be a little tough. But, you cannot die to their, Worm shenanigans. Mono White Humans, I wrote down here, if you lose to this deck, something went wrong. I stand by that statement. You shouldn't lose to Mono White with this deck. Again, Priest of the Forgotten Gods lines up very well against small white creatures. So,
Yeah, sac decks against aggro decks is where you want to be.
Right, exactly. You want to play against the decks that have, Thalia, because Thalia's not really taxing much in this deck. Maybe a Tyvar here and there. I think Phoenix is very close, and then I think Angels is also very, very good. So that's kind of like the 10 most played archetypes and how your favorite. So all in all, I think as long as you can dodge Lotus Field and Mono Green, and then maybe Creativity, I like most of the matchups after that.
Sweet. So why are you playing this deck? Why do you think people should play this deck? I guess especially when Rakdos Sac already exists, right? Like, so why do you think people are drawn to this particular deck, and why do you think that it might have the chops to be a legitimate deck in the format?
So, kind of the base level answer is Collect a Company is a best up card. As I'm sure
good card.
Listeners may be aware, when you cast that card, and if you put 2 3-drops into play, you feel like a genius. The kind of deeper answer, so compared to Rakdos Sacrifice specifically, I know we talked about during the podcast, during this episode, how we don't, this deck can't really kill that fast, but compared to Rakdos Sacrifice, Rakdos Sacrifice is almost killing glacially slow compared to this deck, because between the Vrans and the Zulaports and the Sac Outfits with Woestrider, you can get some relatively fast kills. I think I might have killed somebody on turn... I don't remember if I killed somebody on turn 4. It's rare, but you can kill people on turn 4, turn 5, whereas I think that unimpeded Rakdos Sacrifice maybe has a little bit less of those draws because they don't have Cocos to find the Zulaports and the Vrans. But that's kind of the biggest reason, I think, is also Priest of the Forgotten Gods. A lot better. Rakdos Sacrifice has a horrible matchup against Mono Green. I think this deck actually has a slightly better matchup or more of a chance just because of Priest of the Forgotten Gods. That's how important that card is.
Awesome. Yeah, I think this deck is really intriguing to me. I think that it's one of those decks that I just need a few reps to feel comfortable with the sequencing, with kind of setting up the board states, because I'm so used to just being okay, I understand this combo deck, or I understand this aggressive deck. I really get the A to B progression of what cards I need to cast, in what order, when I need to be attacking, things like that. But with these synergy-based decks that just sort of grind, I feel like you can make some mistakes that cost you the game that aren't as obvious, perhaps, right? Where it's oh man, I should have waited one more turn to do that, or I could have gotten 3 damage there instead of 2 damage, and then my opponent's at 1 and I'm dead, or something like that, right? And I think there's a lot of small edges that you need to be aware of and sort of develop with your practice over time, and that's pretty fun and valuable. And then a lot of people aren't prepared necessarily for decks like this, where not a lot, I feel, is lights out against you. Like, sure, there's certain cards you probably don't want to see, like a Pithing Needle in mono green or something like that, but people aren't hedging their entire strategies or their sideboards against you. So I feel like you're attacking on a unique angle, and a lot of the pieces in your deck are not so obviously dangerous besides maybe Priest, where the opponent's like, well, I know exactly what I have to do to stop what they're doing.
Yeah, one good thing about this deck, too, is the downtick. There's been a slight downtick in Rest in Peace recently. Now, you can beat that card. You have you have Priest that can still work, but one thing is Rest in Peace does shut off both Sulapor Cutthroat and Fran, so it kind of mitigates how fast you can actually kill, so you got to be a little bit careful there. But yeah, I think as far as, like I said, we talked about the 10 most popular decks. I think that I like my matchup against at least 7 of them, 6 or 7 of them. So not a bad place to be, especially if people are not respecting Phoenix as much, because Phoenix has been on the downtick, less graveyard hate than, stuff like that. So
awesome. Well, Devon, I feel like we have focused on this deck enough. My understanding is that Stan and Dave went for a good amount of time, so I don't want to push this episode to unheard of time limits. So thanks again for coming on, our regular guest host, Devon O'Donnell. Devon, you're a full-time streamer. I think like a lot of people know where to find you, but where can people watch you stream a lot of Pioneer these days?
Twitch.tv/DoomWake, d00mwake. Also Twitter and YouTube, both Doomwake as well. And it's been a pleasure to be here, Shane. I thank you very much for the time, and always a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have you on soon. And with that, we're going to wrap this show up. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to the pod. You get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. If you use Apple Podcasts, please feel free to leave us a rating or a review over there. If you want to chat at us, if you want to submit a question, reach out. You can tweet at us, at the Dive Down, all one word. Email thedivedown@gmail.com. If you want to support us, you can join the Patreon at patreon.com/thedivedown. You can also check out our merch store at thedivedown.com/store. You can use Mana Traders to sign up for your subscription there. You can use promo code TheDiveDown10 for 10% off your first 2 months of running Magic Online cards. Of course, amazing shaving soaps, body soaps, fragrances, all that good stuff at Barrister Mann using code TheDiveDown2023. For 15% off your first order. Save some money on paper cards with our friends over at Nerd Rage Gaming. Dive 8% off your order there. Thanks Nowhere, thanks Spaceblood for letting us use your music for these past 4+ years. And until next week, get out there and sacrifice a zombie army.